Elizabeth Whitmore dropped to her knees in the dirt without a single thought for her dress, her reputation, or the circle of silk-clad women who gasped behind her. The man lying beside the unfinished road wasn't moving. Nobody else moved either. They stood in the shade of white party tents, lemonade in hand, watching a human being die 20 yards away like it was someone else's problem. She didn't know his name. She didn't know anything about him except that he needed water and she had some. That was enough for her. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very last word, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1866 arrived in Crawford Valley like a punishment. The kind of heat that pressed down on a person's shoulders and didn't let up. Not at noon, not at dusk, not even when the sun finally dropped behind the Blue Ridge tree line and the fireflies came out over the fields. It was the kind of heat that made men short-tempered and women faint at church. The kind that turned the creek beds to cracked mud and made the air above the road shimmer like something boiling. The Hargrove estate sat at the top of the valley's best hill, and on that particular July afternoon, it wore its wealth like a costume. White canvas tents stretched across the lawn. Long tables draped in imported linen silver pitchers, sweating in the sun. There were perhaps 40 guests gathered beneath those tents, the finest families in 3 counties, come to celebrate Alderman Hargrove's birthday and remind each other and themselves of their position in the world. Elizabeth Whitmore was not supposed to be among them. That is to say, she had been invited barely in the way that distant, impoverished relatives get invited to things as an afterthought, as a courtesy, as a body to fill a chair, so the table looked less empty. She had come from her small rented room in town, wearing her best dress, which was a pale blue cotton that had been washed so many times the color had gone soft and uncertain. No lace trim, no silk ribbon, no pearl buttons. Just clean fabric, a careful press, and her own quiet dignity, holding the whole thing together. She arrived alone. She left her single good bonnet on the chair beside her and tried to make herself useful by helping to pour lemonade, which nobody thanked her for. Margaret Hargrove, the alderman's wife, a sharp-faced woman whose corsets were so tight she breathed in shallow little sips, looked at Elizabeth across the lawn and said to the woman beside her, loudly enough to be heard, "Poor creature, I suppose we had to invite her." John felt obligated after what happened to her father. The woman beside Margaret murmured something in response. "Oh, she's harmless," Margaret said, as though harmless were the most damning thing a person could be. "Just stands there looking at everything like she's memorizing it for later. Strange girl." Her mother had the same quality, very watchful. Elizabeth heard every word of it. She poured the lemonade and did not flinch. She had learned over the 2 years since her father's death that the best response to cruelty from people like Margaret Hargrove was no response at all. Not because she lacked the words, she had plenty of words, whole speeches built up and stored somewhere behind her sternum, but because using them would only confirm what these people already believed about her, that she was ungrateful, difficult below her station in manners, even if not in birth. So she smiled, and she poured, and she watched. She was watching when the trouble started with the workers. The road being built along the eastern edge of the Hargrove property was one of 3 public works projects that Thomas Caldwell, the estate's manager, had contracted his labor crews to complete before September. The workers were a mix of local men who had no other options. Families to feed debts owed on land they rented from the very people at the party, and a handful of newcomers who had drifted into the valley looking for wages after the war. They had been at it since sunrise. It was now well past 2 in the afternoon. Elizabeth watched because she couldn't help it. She watched because the men were moving slower now, their shoulders dropping between each stroke of the pick, their feet dragging on the return step. She watched because not a single one of them had been brought water in the time she'd been standing at this table. She watched because 3 of them were swaying on their feet in a way that had nothing to do with tiredness, and everything to do with their bodies beginning to give out beneath them. And she watched because Thomas Caldwell stood in the partial shade of a young oak tree at the edge of the work site, arms folded across his broad chest, and did not watch them at all. He was looking at his pocket watch, tapping his boot against the root of the tree, waiting for something though she couldn't tell what. "There are water buckets over by the well," Elizabeth said to no one in particular. She was still standing at the lemonade table. The two women nearest her didn't look up from their conversation. "Those men haven't had water in hours." "They're workers, dear," said one of the women, a Mrs. Beaumont, whose husband owned the tannery. She said it without malice, which was almost worse. Just a simple statement of fact, as though workers were a category of person to whom the normal rules of biology didn't apply. "They're accustomed to the heat." "No one is accustomed to dying of it," Elizabeth said. Mrs. Beaumont blinked at her. Then she turned back to her conversation. Elizabeth set down the lemonade pitcher. She took a bucket from beside the well. She filled it herself, working the handle until her palms stung. The water came up cold and dark and smelling of earth, and she carried it across the lawn with both hands past the edge of the tents, past the point where the grass gave way to packed dirt, past the invisible line that separated the party from the work site. She was aware of the silence spreading behind her. She didn't look back. The first man she reached took the ladle from her hand and drank without a word, his throat moving in long, desperate swallows. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 19-20, with sunburned shoulders and a face that still had the unguarded quality of someone who hadn't yet learned to hide how much things hurt. When he handed the ladle back, he said, "Thank you, miss," very quietly, like the words were something private. "Of course," she said. She moved to the next man and the next. None of them said much. Most of them just drank. One older man, gray at the temples with a deep groove worn between his eyebrows from years of squinting into sun, held the ladle for a long moment before drinking and looked at her like she'd done something that confused him deeply. "You're from the party," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm from town," she said. "But yes, I was at the party." "Why'd you come over here?" "Because you needed water." He looked at the ladle. He looked at her. He drank. It was when she reached the far end of the line that she saw the man lying on the ground. I was half in the shadow of the unfinished roadbed, which wasn't much shadow at all, just a stripe of it barely wide enough to cover his face. He'd gone down on his side, one arm folded under him, one hand still loosely gripping the handle of a pickaxe. He was breathing. She could see the rise and fall of his ribs, but it was labored shallow, the kind of breathing that meant the body was running on the last of what it had. I was built like a man who worked hard for a living. Broad through the shoulders, weathered in every piece of skin she could see, with calluses on both hands, so thick they looked like they'd grown there deliberately. His coat, such as it was just a rough linen workshirt, was soaked through with sweat. His face, turned slightly toward the ground, had strong lines to it. Not a young man's face, but not an old one. Somewhere in the middle of his 30s, she thought. She knelt down beside him. "Sir?" She put her hand on his shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" Nothing. "Sir." Behind her, she heard laughter. It came from the direction of the party, not close but close enough. She didn't turn around. She heard Margaret Hargrove's voice, light and amused. "Oh, look at that. She's found herself a patient. I told you she was strange." More laughter. Softer, polite. The kind of laughter women like Margaret produced so naturally they didn't even know they were doing it. Elizabeth did not turn around. She tipped the ladle against the man's lips and let the water run slow, just enough to wet them. His eyelids moved. She did it again. His throat moved. "Come on," she said quietly. "Just a little, just enough to come back." His eyes opened. They were gray. Not pale gray, a deep, considerable gray, the color of river water before a storm. They came into focus slowly, and for a moment they just looked at her. Just looked with an intensity that startled her, like he was reading something written on her face. "Can you sit up?" she asked. He moved. She helped him, one hand on his arm, steadying. He sat up slowly, and she put the ladle to his lips again, and this time he drank properly, 3 long, careful swallows. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low and rough from the heat. "Ma'am." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Can you walk?" He looked at her like the question surprised him. Yes, I think so." "Good. Because Thomas Caldwell is heading this way, and he does not look pleased." Caldwell crossed the distance between the oak tree and the roadside in long, deliberate strides, the kind of walk that announced itself, that expected people to move out of its way. He was a thick man, thick neck, thick hands, thick with a confidence that had never once been seriously challenged, and he carried a ledger book under one arm that he used. Elizabeth had noticed less for actual record-keeping, and more as a prop to demonstrate that he was the kind of man who kept records and therefore couldn't be argued with. "Whitmore," he said, not bothering with any honorific. "What in God's name do you think you're doing over here?" "Bringing water to men who needed it," she said. She had stood up by then, bucket in one hand, ladle in the other, and she did not take a single step back. "That is not your concern." "It became my concern when I watched 3 men nearly collapse and no one moved to help them." Caldwell's jaw tightened. He looked past her at the man still sitting on the ground. Something shifted in his expression, not quite recognition, but something adjacent to it. Calculation, maybe. A rapid internal assessment of a variable he hadn't expected. "Crawford," he said. "On your feet." The man Crawford apparently got to his feet without hurrying. He moved carefully like a man who was still taking stock of what his body had left in it, but he got there. He was taller than Elizabeth had realized, standing a full head above Caldwell, and something about the way he stood, settled, deliberate weight, evenly distributed, made Caldwell shift his own footing slightly, without seeming to know he'd done it. "You took a rest in the middle of the work period," Caldwell said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It was the shape of one. "I did," Crawford said. "That's a deduction from your wages. I know your policies. Then you know I don't make exceptions." Crawford said nothing. His eyes moved from Caldwell to the rest of the crew who had all stopped working and were watching carefully with the particular stillness of men who know that watching too openly is its own kind of risk. Then his eyes moved to Elizabeth. "I'm grateful for the water," he said, to her. Directly, without any of the deflection she was accustomed to receiving from men who found her presence inconvenient. "You're welcome," she said. Caldwell made a sound of dismissal and turned back toward the party. "Get back to work," he said to everyone and no one. "All of you." Elizabeth returned the bucket to the well. She refilled it and brought it back because no one else was going to, and because the men still needed water, and because some part of her had stopped caring, at least for that afternoon, about the opinion of people who could watch a man lie dying in the sun and call it someone else's problem. She made 3 trips. By the third one, 2 of the younger workers were helping her carry taking the bucket the last stretch to where it was needed, passing the ladle between themselves. Nobody said much. It wasn't a conversation. It was just people doing what needed to be done. She did not see Crawford again during those 3 trips, not directly. She was aware of him, the way you're aware of something that isn't quite where you expect it to be. His voice once speaking to another worker. His presence somewhere to her left, moving with a quiet steadiness that was different from the others, though she couldn't have said exactly how. What she knew was that he did not go back to the same punishing pace as the men around him. Worked, she could see that, but he worked in a way that suggested he was conserving something. Measuring. Like a man who had a longer game in mind than the afternoon. She filed that away. The party reassembled under the white tents as the worst of the heat broke and the shadows started reaching east. Someone brought out a fiddle. Margaret Hargrove held court at the head table with her usual precision, dispersing small cruelties, like party favors, 1 per guest. Alderman Hargrove himself had been drinking since noon and was now in a magnanimous phase, clapping men on the back and telling long stories about his grandfather's land grants. Elizabeth ate a small plate of food, standing near the edge of the tent, where she could feel the first suggestion of an evening breeze. She was not invited to sit at the head table, which was fine. She had no wish to. "You caused quite a scene," said a voice beside her. She turned. A young woman named Helen Archer, daughter of a merchant family, quiet in the way that comes from paying close attention, was standing next to her with a plate of her own. Helen was one of the few people at these gatherings who ever spoke to Elizabeth without a subtext. "I gave water to men who were about to die of heat," Elizabeth said. "I wouldn't call that a scene. Margaret would. Margaret calls everything she doesn't control a scene." Helen made a sound that was almost a laugh. He was looking at you, she said after a moment. Who was? The worker. The tall one. Crawford. I think someone called him. He was looking at you the whole time you were making those trips to the well. I noticed because everyone else was pretending not to watch you, and he was the only one watching you directly. Elizabeth considered that. He was probably just grateful. Maybe, Helen said. She didn't sound convinced. The workers were dismissed as the sun touched the treetops. Elizabeth watched them go. Watched the slow dispersal of tired men, gathering their coats and tools, rolling their shoulders, speaking low to each other in voices that carried the particular flatness of exhaustion. She watched Caldwell stand at the edge of the worksite with his ledger marking something down, and she watched the men pass him one by one, each one's face careful and neutral. In that way people's faces get when they're in the presence of someone who has power over their livelihood. Crawford was the last one she saw. He had stopped to help one of the older men, the gray-templed one who'd looked at her like she'd confused him, get a piece of equipment loaded onto a cart. She watched him take the heavy end without being asked. Watched him do it with the kind of economy of motion that meant he'd done this kind of thing 10,000 times. He didn't look toward the party. He didn't look toward her. But just before he walked away, following the others down the road, toward wherever the workers were housed for the project, he stopped. He reached into the pocket of his work shirt and took something out. He looked at it for a moment. She was too far away to see what it was, and then he put it back and kept walking. She thought about that small gesture for longer than made sense. Elizabeth. Her cousin Robert found her as the party was winding down, when the candles on the tables were burning low and the fiddle had put itself away. Robert was 26 and red-faced in the particular way of men who spent more time at tables than outdoors. He was not unkind exactly, but he had never learned to look at Elizabeth without seeing an expense. "People are talking," he said, "about me, about what you did, going over to the worksite, fraternizing with the laborers." He kept his voice low, which she supposed was a courtesy of a kind. "Aunt Margaret is not pleased. Aunt Margaret's displeasure is not new information to me, Robert." "Elizabeth," he sighed, "I know you think these things don't matter, but they do. Your reputation is it's fragile. You can't afford—" "What can't I afford?" she asked. The question came out quiet and clear, not angry, just genuinely curious. "I have no inheritance, no prospects, no family fortune to protect. I live in 2 rented rooms, and I mend my own clothes, and I was nearly not invited to this party. What exactly is the reputation I'm supposed to be protecting from whom? For what purpose?" Robert opened his mouth, closed it. "I gave water to men who were going to die of heat," she said. "I would do it again tomorrow. If that costs me Margaret Hargrove's good opinion, I can only say that seems like a fair trade." She excused herself before he could answer. She walked home alone, as she always did. The road into town from the Hargrove estate ran about a mile along the creek, and she knew every inch of it by now, every route that crossed the path, every place where the bank sloped and you had to step carefully, every bend where the creek widened and you could hear it running even in July. She was thinking about the man on the ground. Crawford. Not romantically, she had learned over years of watching these things from the outside that the romances that looked beautiful from a distance often felt quite different up close. She was thinking about him practically, about the way he'd looked at her when his eyes first opened, about the way he'd stood up in front of Caldwell, not aggressive, not deferential, just level, the way a man stands when he's got nothing to prove but also nothing to lose, about the ledger Caldwell carried everywhere, about the wages she'd heard workers discuss in town, which seemed every time she heard them discussed to be somehow less than what had been promised, about the fact that the man called Crawford had not looked like a man who was surprised to understand complex things. He had looked like a man who was being careful about what he let other people see him understand. She was still thinking about it when she reached her front door. She sat at her small writing desk for a long time that evening, her journal open in front of her, and wrote nothing. Just sat there with the pen in her hand, thinking about a pair of gray eyes that had come into focus and found her already there. 3 days later, she saw him again. She had gone to the public market on the north edge of town as she did every Thursday, partly for the vegetables and cheese, partly for the particular kind of information that moved between the stalls in the form of gossip and complaint and carefully worded concern. She had learned growing up poor on the edges of wealthy society that markets were where the real news traveled. Not drawing rooms, not church pews, markets. She was examining a basket of late summer apples when she heard his voice. "I'd like the account ledgers from June through September of last year." She turned her head slightly without turning her whole body. He was at the stall opposite the one run by a man named Perkins, who handled the postal and records business for 3 of the county estates. Crawford was standing with his back mostly to her, but she could see his profile, the same strong lines, the same careful stillness. He was dressed the same as before. Work clothes, rough cut. Nothing that indicated anything but his voice, asking for those ledgers, had an authority to it that snagged her attention. Perkins said, "Those records are restricted to estate management, Mr. Crawford," he said. "I'm aware of the restriction. I'm also aware that requests can be filed with the county recorder's office for review. I'd like to do that." Perkins looked at him. Crawford looked back at Perkins. It was not a hostile exchange. It was simply the exchange between a man who expected to get what he asked for eventually, and a man trying to decide how much trouble not giving it would cause. "I'll need your name and address of record," Perkins said finally. "N. Crawford," he said. "CO the Crawford Valley Workers' Camp." He turned then, not deliberately toward her, just the natural turn of a man who'd finished his business and was reorienting himself. And he saw her. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, not quite. Something more like acknowledgement. Like a calculation confirmed. He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps and stopped at a respectful distance, tipping his hat in the slight contained gesture of a man who's been taught manners but doesn't perform them. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She blinked. "You know my name." "I asked," he said simply. "You asked?" "After the other day. I wanted to know the name of the person who—" He paused, chose the words carefully. "Who thought it was worth walking across a lawn for?" She looked at him for a moment. The market went on around them. Voices, footsteps, the creak of cartwheels, someone arguing about the price of salt pork. "Account ledgers," she said, "from the Crawford Valley estates." He didn't look away. "That's right. That's not something a road worker would typically request." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He waited. She had the sense he was allowing her to reach her own conclusions, which she found unexpectedly refreshing. Most men either rushed to explain themselves or got defensive. He just waited. "I've heard," she said carefully, "from some of the women in town, wives of men who work the valley sites, that wages have been short. 3-4 months running. The men sign for what they're promised and receive something less and have no record of the difference." Crawford was very still. "I've also heard," she continued, "that Caldwell keeps 2 sets of ledgers, one for the county, one for himself." "Where did you hear that?" he asked. His voice was neutral, but she could feel the attention behind it sharpen. "The same place I hear most things," she said. "Standing in market stalls, listening to women whose husbands can't say out loud what they know." He looked at her for a long, measuring moment. Then something in his expression shifted, not open, not trusting, not yet, but the faintest widening of a door. "Miss Whitmore," he said slowly, "I wonder if I could ask you something." "You can ask," she said. "Do you know anyone in this county who might be willing to speak on record about what they've seen or heard regarding the estate accounts?" Elizabeth thought about the gray-templed man with the deep groove between his eyebrows, about the women who gathered around the market with their carefully lowered voices and their careful eyes, about all the small crimes she had watched accumulate season after season in a community where the people who could do something chose not to look. "I might," she said. He nodded once slowly. "Then I think," he said, "that we need to have a longer conversation than this." She looked at him. The market hummed around them. Somewhere behind his careful closed face was a man who'd been asking for account ledgers under his own name, in a town where his own name meant something whether he intended it to or not. "I think," she said, "you might be right." She tucked her basket over her arm and looked at him steadily. "But first," she said, "I think you owe me your real story, because N. Crawford requesting Crawford Valley estate records, standing in a county market with the bearing of a man who owns things, that is not the whole picture. And I don't form alliances with people whose pictures aren't whole." He was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time since she'd seen him lying on the ground 3 days ago, something crossed his face that wasn't caution. Something smaller, warmer, and she thought somewhat reluctant. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you do." He looked away down the market lane, then back at her. "There's a bench by the North Creek Bridge," he said. "It's quiet there most mornings before 7. "I know the bench," she said. "Tomorrow." She considered him, this man with his carefully controlled face, and his labor calluses, and his estate ledger request, for one more moment. "Tomorrow," she said. She walked away. She did not look back. But she heard just faintly the sound of him exhaling behind her, slow, deliberate. The sound of a man releasing a breath he'd been holding for much longer than one afternoon. She was at the bench before him. That was the first thing Nathaniel Crawford noticed when he came around the bend of the North Creek Bridge at 6:45 in the morning. Elizabeth Whitmore was already there, sitting straight-backed with a small leather journal open across her knee and a stub of pencil in her hand, writing something. She did not look up when she heard his footsteps on the packed earth of the path. She finished her sentence first. Then she looked up. "You're early," he said. "I'm always early," she said. "It's one of the few advantages of having nowhere particularly important to be." He sat down on the opposite end of the bench, far enough to be decent, close enough to speak quietly. The creek moved along below them, and the air still held the night's coolness in it, which wouldn't last another hour once the sun cleared the tree line. He had about 40 minutes before he was expected at the worksite. He had spent most of the night deciding how much to tell her. The problem was that she had already told him more than he expected. The 2 ledger sets. The short wages. The women in the market with their carefully lowered voices. She had been watching things he had only recently started looking for, and she had been watching them longer, and that changed the calculation considerably. "You said you wanted the whole picture," he said. "I did. Some of it isn't mine to share yet." He held her gaze. "Not because I don't trust you. Because there are people whose safety depends on the information staying contained until the right moment." She considered that. "All right," she said. "Then tell me what you can." He looked at the creek for a moment, looked back. "My name is Nathaniel Crawford," he said. "The valley is named for my grandfather. The estate, the houses, the farmland, the timber rights, the road contracts, all of it was put into trust when my father died 12 years ago. Thomas Caldwell was appointed trustee by the county court. I was 20 at the time. I was living in Philadelphia." Elizabeth did not react. She was watching him the way she'd watched the party, steadily, without performance. "When did you come back?" she asked. 4 months ago, quietly." He paused. "I'd been getting letters. From some of the tenants. From a man named Gareth Howell, the older man, gray hair. You gave him water before me." "I remember him. He's been on Crawford land for 30 years, his father before him. He wrote to me 3 times over 2 years before I believed it was serious enough to come back and see for myself." He stopped. "What Caldwell has done to this valley in 12 years, it is not a small thing, Miss Whitmore. The wages are the surface of it." "Then what's underneath?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, she could feel the difference. He was choosing the order of things. "Land," he said finally. "Tenants who've farmed the same parcels for 2 and 3 generations, whose lease agreements have been rewritten without their knowledge, whose rent has doubled on paper while their wages were cut. Caldwell has been compressing people from both ends, paying them less, charging them more, and pocketing the difference through a management fee structure that he wrote himself and filed with the county clerk as a routine administrative update." Elizabeth's pencil had stopped moving. "He filed it himself," she said. "With himself as both the filing party and the approving trustee. The county clerk at the time was a man named Aldous Webb. Webb died 2 years ago." Nathaniel paused. Conveniently. She was very still. "How much are we talking about?" "Enough," he said. Enough that if it came to court, Caldwell would lose everything. His position, his assets, potentially his freedom. Which is why the ledgers matter. The real ones. Not the set he shows the county, the set he keeps at his house. I know they exist. Gareth Howell has seen them. 2 other men have seen them. But seeing and being able to prove are different things. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. "You're not a road worker," she said. "No. You're working the road crew so Caldwell doesn't know you're here. Caldwell has never met me. My father died when I was a boy. I was sent to Philadelphia for schooling and stayed. There is no portrait of me at the estate house. My father wasn't the type for portraits. As far as Caldwell is concerned, the heir to Crawford Valley is a distant abstraction who has shown no interest in returning." He let a beat pass. "I intended to keep it that way until I had enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough to take to a federal land commissioner. This has gone beyond county jurisdiction. Caldwell has been manipulating county records for over a decade. I can't trust any county official to rule impartially. I need federal standing." The creek moved below them. Somewhere upstream a bird was complaining about something. "You said you wanted to know if anyone would speak on record," Elizabeth said slowly. "But that's not all you need, is it? Witnesses alone won't be enough. You need the ledgers." He looked at her steadily. "Yes. And you can't get them yourself, because Caldwell knows your face now, after the other day." Something moved across his expression. The faintest tightening, which she was beginning to understand, meant she'd said something accurate that he would have preferred to say first. "He knows the face of a road worker named Crawford," Nathaniel said. "He has no reason to connect that man to the estate heir. But you're right that I can't walk into his office and ask for the documents without revealing more than I can afford to reveal yet." Elizabeth closed her journal. "I can," she said. He opened his mouth. She kept going. "I'm a woman with no legal standing, no property, and no visible reason to threaten anyone," she said. "I moved through this valley completely unnoticed. Caldwell looked straight through me at the Hargrove party. I watched him do it. I am, in the language of people like Thomas Caldwell, completely irrelevant." She looked at him squarely. "That is an extraordinary advantage." Nathaniel was quiet. "I'm not asking you to let me do this," she said. "I'm telling you that I can, and that you would be foolish to refuse my help on the grounds of some misguided notion about protecting me from inconvenience. I've been managing inconvenience my entire adult life. I'm very good at it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he said. "You don't know me. This could go wrong in ways that would cost you the little you have. Because Gareth Howell's wife takes in washing to cover the rent gap, and she's been doing it for 4 years, Elizabeth said. Because there are children in this valley who are going to school hungry because their father's wages were stolen by a man in a well-cut coat with a ledger under his arm. Because I have been standing on the outside of other people's comfort my entire life, watching injustice happen, and being told it isn't my place to say anything." She held his gaze. "I'm done being told what my place is." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that forms when something true has been said, and the air needs a moment to accommodate it. Nathaniel took off his hat. He turned it once in his hands, a gesture she was learning was the thing he did when he was arriving at a decision. "All right," he said. "But nothing without telling me first. Not a single step that I don't know about before you take it. These people are not playing at anything. Caldwell has dismissed 3 workers in the last 2 months who asked too many questions about their pay. One of them has a family in Kentucky who hasn't heard from him since." She heard what he wasn't saying. "You think something happened to him. I think it's possible," he said carefully. "And I think you should know the full weight of what you're agreeing to." She let that settle, felt the seriousness of it all the way down. "I understand," she said. He put his hat back on. "Then we need a way to communicate that doesn't involve meeting at creek benches at dawn." "Helen Archer," Elizabeth said. "Merchant's daughter. She attends the Thursday market and she is completely trustworthy. Messages can pass through her." He nodded. "And I need to know every person you think might speak. Every name, what they saw, how long ago. Don't approach any of them yet, just the names." "I'll have a list by Thursday." He stood up and she stood with him, and they faced each other across the small gap of the bench, with the creek moving below them and the morning warming by the minute. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "for what it's worth, I have been working this problem alone for 4 months. What you told me yesterday about the double ledgers is the first concrete corroboration I've had from a source outside the workers' camp." He paused. "You may have just changed the entire shape of this." She didn't say you're welcome. It wasn't that kind of moment. "Thursday," she said, and walked back up the path toward town. She did not go straight home. She went to the market because it was Thursday, and she always went to the market, and because if anything about her routine changed even slightly, people would notice, and in a place like Crawford Valley, the people most likely to notice were the ones she least wanted paying attention. She moved through the stalls the same way she always did, stopping at the same vendors, buying the same modest quantities of the same modest goods. She smiled at the right people and said politely forgettable things in the right places. And she listened. Gareth Howell's wife, a compact woman named Ruth, with hands that were red from work, and a mouth that had learned to stay carefully neutral, in most company, was buying flour at the grain stall when Elizabeth appeared beside her. "Mrs. Howell," Elizabeth said, as though it were an ordinary greeting. "The lavender soap you recommended last month has been wonderful." Ruth Howell had not recommended any soap last month. They both knew this. But Ruth Howell was also a woman who had been married to a man on Crawford land for 30 years, and she understood the vocabulary of conversations that weren't the conversations they appeared to be. "I'm glad it worked," Ruth said. She kept her eyes on the grain vendor's scale. "My husband has had better sleep this week, better than he's had in a while." Elizabeth nodded, adding a small bag of salt to her basket. "The summer heat makes sleep difficult, but things might get easier soon. I've heard there are people looking into certain administrative matters in the valley." Ruth's hands went very still on the edge of the grain stall counter. "Have you?" she said. Her voice was perfectly flat, the kind of flat that isn't absence of feeling. It's the presence of very controlled feeling. "I have," Elizabeth said. "And when the time comes, it would help to know whether certain people with first-hand knowledge might be willing to step forward, with protections in place, proper ones." Ruth turned and looked at her, then fully directly in a way she hadn't before. Elizabeth met her gaze without flinching. "My husband has papers," Ruth said, quietly, so quietly that the ambient noise of the market covered it entirely. "Work records he kept himself against the official ones. He kept them because he's been keeping records since he was 15, and he doesn't know how to stop. They've been under the floorboard in the kitchen for 2 years. Elizabeth's pulse moved. "Don't touch them yet," she said. "Just know where they are." Ruth turned back to the scale. "I always know where they are," she said. "I check every week." By Thursday afternoon, Elizabeth had 7 names. Gareth Howell. Ruth Howell, by proxy. A farmhand named James Pryor, whose lease had been rewritten twice without his knowledge. A woman named Clara Bennett Widow, whose late husband had documented his wage statements in a personal account book, which she'd preserved without understanding their significance. 2 brothers, Eli and Samuel Crane, who had witnessed Caldwell meeting privately with the county clerk Webb 6 months before Webb's death. And a young teacher at the Valley's single schoolroom, a man named Patrick Oakes, who had noticed that the donations recorded in the school's public ledger, supposedly paid annually from Crawford estate funds, had stopped arriving 3 years ago, while the ledger continued to show them as paid. She wrote the names in her journal in a private shorthand. Her father had taught her. Letters, transposed vowels, represented by small shapes that looked like nothing to anyone who hadn't learned it. She tore the page out, carefully folded it, and passed it to Helen Archer at the Thursday market, inside a small cloth parcel that appeared to contain a return of borrowed ribbon. Helen received it without looking at it. "You're being very careful," she said in a conversational tone, examining a bolt of calico. "I'm learning from someone who is very careful," Elizabeth said. "Is he trustworthy?" Elizabeth thought about a man who had asked for ledgers under his own name in a public market who had been carrying the weight of 12 years of theft on behalf of people he barely knew, who had looked at her across a bench that morning with the particular intensity of someone who has been alone with a problem for too long and is only now daring to believe help has arrived. "Yes," she said. "I think he is." The list reached Nathaniel through Helen that same evening. He read it at the workers' camp after the fire had died down and the men around him were asleep. He read it twice. Then he sat for a long time with the paper in his hands, not reading it anymore, just holding it. 7 names. She had found 7 names in 3 days, in conversations conducted at grain stalls and through borrowed ribbon parcels, in the currency of women's ordinary movement through a community, and at least 3 of them had documentary evidence he hadn't known existed. Gareth Howell had records. Of course he did. The man had been watching Caldwell's operation with quiet, patient fury for years. He'd written 3 letters to the absent heir of Crawford Valley, and gotten no response for 2 of them, and still he'd kept his records under the floorboard waiting. The thought of that, the patience of it, the long quiet faith that someone would eventually come, did something uncomfortable to the place behind Nathaniel's sternum that he had spent a considerable amount of energy keeping numb. He came from people who had caused this. His family's trust, his family's land, the structural arrangement of power that had given Caldwell his position, all of that came from the Crawfords. His grandfather, his father. Men who had built something and then assumed in the way that people with power often assumed that the thing they'd built would remain decent without anyone actively maintaining its decency. It had not remained decent. And Nathaniel had been in Philadelphia for 12 years, building his own small life, while Gareth Howell kept records under a floorboard, and Ruth Howell's hands got redder every year from taking in extra washing. He folded the list, put it inside his boot against the sole where it would stay dry. Tomorrow he needed to get to the county recorder's office without Caldwell finding out. He needed to cross-reference the public estate ledgers against what he already knew of the real numbers. He needed to do this without the use of his name, which was going to be complicated, because as of yesterday, Perkins at the postal stall knew he'd requested the records, and Perkins, he had since learned, was a man who found it useful to keep Thomas Caldwell informed. He lay down on his cot in the dark workers' camp and stared at the ceiling and thought about the problem. Then he thought almost against his will about Elizabeth Whitmore, sitting on that bench in the early morning, her journal open, her pencil moving, the absolute lack of performance in her face when she looked at him. He had told her things he hadn't told anyone in Crawford Valley. He had told her because she already knew half of it, and because the other half had simply come, had arrived in the space she'd made with her directness and her complete absence of self-deception. He needed to be careful about that. She was a valuable ally. She was sharp, and she was brave, and she moved through this community with a freedom he didn't have. But she was also a woman with no protection, no legal standing, and no family capable of insulating her from consequences. If Caldwell identified her as part of any investigation, he stopped the thought. He needed to make sure that didn't happen. He needed to be very sure. He nearly got what he was afraid of 3 days later. He was at the work site, the Eastern Road 3rd section, which was the furthest from the estate house and the hardest to oversee, when Caldwell appeared in the middle of the afternoon, which he almost never did. Caldwell supervised from a distance. His appearance at the actual site was either discipline or something worse. He walked directly to where Nathaniel was working and stood there. "Crawford," he said. Nathaniel straightened up, slowly. The way a tired worker does, not the way a man with something to hide does. "Mr. Caldwell, I hear you were at Perkins's stall last week." "I was," Nathaniel said, "requesting records. Public records, the county recorder's index. I was looking into whether I had a claim on wages from a previous job." He kept his voice flat, workman plain. "Turned out I didn't. The records weren't there." Caldwell looked at him. "What previous job?" "Road contract in Albemarle County, 2 summers back. Foreman shorted us on the final payment. I've been trying to track it down through county filings." He met Caldwell's eyes with the steady patience of a man who has nothing interesting to hide. "Wasn't successful. I'll try the Albemarle office next time I have a day free." Caldwell studied him. Nathaniel was aware in the stretched-out quality of the silence that this was the moment. This was the variable whether Caldwell was the kind of man who trusted his calculations or the kind who trusted his gut. If he was the second kind, this was going to go wrong very quickly. "You requested Crawford Valley estate records," Caldwell said. "The clerk said they were restricted," Nathaniel said. "I figured I had the name in common. It was a long shot. Not the sharpest thinking I've ever done." He let the faintest rueful quality into his voice, the sound of a man embarrassed by his own foolishness. "The name Crawford's not exactly unusual out here." Another silence, shorter this time. "No," Caldwell said. "It isn't." He looked at Nathaniel once more, with the assessing quality of a man who stores people in categories and is deciding where this one goes. Then he turned and walked back toward the estate end of the road without another word. Nathaniel went back to work. He did not release the tension in his shoulders until Caldwell was fully out of sight. Even then, he released it gradually, 1 degree at a time, the way you would let air out of something that might still be needed. I was going to have to move faster. Caldwell was not a stupid man. He had survived 12 years on the strength of careful observation and ruthless preemption. The question of the ledger records would not stay closed. It would get nudged at, turned over, examined from different angles until either it resolved into something innocuous or it didn't. And if it didn't, Nathaniel needed the physical ledgers. He needed them before Caldwell had any real reason to move them. He got word to Elizabeth that night through Gareth Howell, a verbal message only, no paper, that he needed to speak with her urgently, and that he would be at the market the following morning earlier than usual. Elizabeth was there. She had dark circles under her eyes that told him she hadn't slept well, and her jaw had the set quality of a woman who has been thinking about something difficult for several hours and has arrived at conclusions she doesn't entirely like. She handed him a small wrapped parcel of bread as though she were selling it. "Caldwell spoke to me yesterday," she said very quietly. "At the dry goods store. He was pleasant, very pleasant. He asked how long I was staying in town. He asked if I was enjoying the summer. He asked if my cousin Robert had seen to my comfort." The word comfort in her mouth had a very specific and unpleasant quality. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He was measuring you. Yes. She looked at the bread parcel between them. "He also asked if I'd met any of the estate workers during the Hargrove party." She paused. "I said I'd spoken briefly to 1 or 2 of the men at the water bucket, but that I didn't know their names." He smiled and said that was very kind of me. Then he went back to buying his tobacco. "What kind of smile?" Nathaniel asked. She looked at him. "The kind that isn't one." He looked away down the market lane. The pressure behind his eyes was familiar now, the feeling of a situation that had been moving at a manageable pace beginning to accelerate. "We have to get the ledgers this week," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about how." "Elizabeth." She looked at him sharply. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and they both noticed it at the same moment. He didn't apologize for it. There wasn't time. "Caldwell holds a monthly dinner for the county men of business," she said, going forward, as though the name hadn't happened. "First Friday of the month. He is away from the estate house from 7 in the evening until past midnight. The house staff is reduced on those evenings. He takes his senior manservant with him. There will be a kitchen girl and a groundskeeper." "How do you know this?" "Clara Bennett, the widow whose husband kept wage records. Her niece is the kitchen girl." Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "The niece will be in the kitchen all evening. The groundskeeper is an elderly man named Peter, who has been mostly deaf since a cannon fired too close to him in the war, and who falls asleep in his chair by 8. He stared at her. "You planned this," he said. "I thought about what was needed," she said. "And then I asked the right people the right questions. Elizabeth, you cannot be the one to go into that house." "And you cannot," she said with a precision that was almost gentle. "You live on that worksite with 30 men who report to Caldwell's foreman. If you disappear for an evening, it will be noted. I live alone in 2 rented rooms and come and go as I please, and no one in this town thinks my comings and goings are worth tracking. If he catches you in his house, he won't be there. If something goes wrong, Nathaniel." She said his name the same way he'd said hers, without deciding to just letting it come. And then she kept talking steady and clear. I understand the risk. I have understood the risk since the morning on that bench. I am asking you to understand that I have made my choice, and that refusing to respect it is its own kind of harm. She held his gaze. I know what I'm doing. Let me do it. The market moved around them. Voices, footsteps, the mundane noise of ordinary life, continuing in its ordinary grooves, while the two of them stood in the middle of it, negotiating the terms of something that had moved without either of them choosing it well past the boundaries of a simple alliance. He looked at her. Really looked, and what he saw was not recklessness. It was the kind of courage that knows exactly what it's afraid of and moves forward anyway, which was the only kind that mattered. Tell me the layout of the house, he said. I've never been inside. Clara Bennett's niece has. She nodded once. Get me a floor plan, he said. Every room, where the office is, whether the ledgers are likely kept locked, any other staff I should know about. By tonight. By tonight. She picked up the bread parcel and tucked it into her basket. To anyone watching, they had simply exchanged small pleasantries about market goods. She turned to go. Elizabeth, he said. She stopped, did not turn. After this is done, he said. Whatever happens, I want you to know. He stopped, chose the end of the sentence carefully, because the sentence he'd started reaching for was not the one he was ready to say. I want you to know that what you're doing, what you've already done, it matters. It will matter to people who don't even know your name yet. She was quiet for a moment. It should have been done years ago, she said. By someone with more power than either of us. She paused. But they didn't. So we will. She walked away down the market lane, her basket on her arm, her back straight. She did not look back, but the space she left behind her had a particular weight to it, the weight of someone who has just shifted the center of gravity of a situation. Nathaniel stood in the market for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he pulled his hat down and went back to work. The floor plan arrived that evening. Clara Bennett's niece, a girl of 17 named Susanna, who had the look of someone who had spent years learning to be invisible in other people's houses, drew it on the back of a flour sack paper in careful pencil lines. Elizabeth sat across from her at Clara's kitchen table and watched her draw and did not rush her because Susanna's hands were trembling slightly and rushing. A trembling person never produced accurate information. The office is here, Susanna said, pointing to a rectangle in the back left corner of the ground floor. It's the only room with a lock on the inside of the door as well as the outside. Mr. Caldwell locks it from the inside when he's working in there and doesn't want to be disturbed. The key lives on his person during the day and on a hook beside his bed at night. But on the evenings he attends the business dinners, Elizabeth said. Does he take the key with him? Susanna thought about this. He always locks the office before he leaves, always. I've seen him check the door handle twice before he's satisfied. She paused. But last month I was in the hall linen closet when he came through. I heard the key go back on the hook in his bedroom. I think when he's leaving for the whole evening he doesn't want to risk losing it at the dinner. Elizabeth looked at the floor plan. His bedroom is here, second floor, top of the stairs, east side. Yes, ma'am. And Peter the groundskeeper, where does he sleep? Outbuilding back of the property. He doesn't come inside after 8 unless there's trouble. Susanna paused again. Miss Whitmore, if Mr. Caldwell ever found out I helped with this. He won't find out from me, Elizabeth said. And when this is finished, he won't have the power to hurt you regardless. Susanna looked at her with the expression of someone who has been given that kind of promise before and has stopped believing it reflexively. You sound very certain. I am, Elizabeth said. Because the man working to end this is the actual owner of everything Thomas Caldwell has been pretending to control, and he knows what he's doing. She passed the floor plan to Nathaniel through Gareth Howell that same night, folded inside a work glove. She included a single sentence in her own shorthand at the bottom: Friday. I go. Not negotiable. His response came back before dawn on Friday morning, slipped under her door on a piece of paper torn from a work ledger. Northeast corner of the property, 10 o'clock. I'll be there. Not agreement exactly, but presence. which was the next best thing. She waited until 9:30 before she moved. The town was quiet in the particular way of early Friday evenings, when the working men were home at their tables, and the social men were at their dinners, and the space between those two worlds belonged briefly to no one. She wore her darkest dress, the charcoal wool she normally saved for funerals, which had the advantage of being both unremarkable and difficult to see in low light, and she carried nothing she couldn't afford to lose. Nathaniel was already at the northeast corner when she arrived. He had changed out of his work clothes into something darker as well, and he was standing with his back to the property's boundary fence, in the relaxed posture of a man who has found his position and intends to stay in it. "You came," she said. "I said I would. I thought you might decide to override me and do this yourself." "I considered it," he said. "And then I thought about what you'd say to me afterward, and decided it wasn't worth it." It was the closest thing to a joke she'd heard from him, and it surprised her enough that she almost smiled. Almost. "The dinner started at 7, she said. "Caldwell won't leave before 11 at the earliest. These men drink long. We have the time, but not extra. You know the layout. I have it memorized." She had spent the afternoon with Susanna's flour sack paper until she could close her eyes and walk every corridor in the dark. "The key is in his bedroom. The office is locked. I go up, get the key, come down, open. The office, find the secondary ledger set, and come out." What if the ledgers aren't immediately visible? Susanna said there's a second desk in the office with a locked drawer on the right side. She's seen Caldwell open it with a small brass key that he keeps separate from the office key on his watch chain. She paused. "I can't get that key without getting near him." "No," Nathaniel said. "But a locked drawer in a desk can be opened without a key given the right tool, and about 4 minutes. He held up a thin metal implement she didn't recognize. "I've done it before." "When?" "I spent 6 months doing land inventory work in Georgia. The surveyor I worked with had a habit of locking things and forgetting where he'd put the keys." He tucked the tool away. "We're going in together." "Nathaniel, I'll stay to the back. You're the one they'd expect to see if someone happens to look a woman visiting wrong night, innocent mistake. I'm the one they wouldn't expect, which means I can't be seen at all." He looked at her. "But I'm not standing out here while you're in there alone." She wanted to argue. The argument was sound, but the part of her that had been carrying this alone, all of it, the weight of knowing and not yet being able to act, felt something loosen slightly at the words, "I'm not standing out here while you're in there alone." "Fine," she said. "We move quickly, no hesitation." "Agreed. And if something goes wrong, we run," he said simply. "Same direction, different paths. Meet back at the creek bench. All right?" She turned toward the property. "Let's go." The house was quieter than she'd expected. People describe silence in old houses as heavy or watchful, but this silence was neither. It was just the ordinary absence of Thomas Caldwell, which turned out to be the thing that had been giving the building its weight all along. They moved through the ground floor without speaking. Nathaniel was behind her and to the left close enough that she could hear his breathing. Even controlled the kind of breathing that required active management. She appreciated that. It told her he was taking this seriously without being afraid, which was exactly the ratio she needed. The stairs were where they slowed. Old staircases in houses of this period announced themselves, and this one was no exception. She tested each step before committing her weight, feeling for the give that preceded sound, taking the outside edge where the wood was older and more settled. Nathaniel followed her method without instruction. The bedroom key was where Susanna had said it would be. Elizabeth crossed the room and took it off the hook and held it in her palm, and for one moment just breathed. Then she turned and nodded to Nathaniel, and they went back down. The office key turned smoothly. The door opened. They were inside. "Desk," she said quietly. He was already at it. The locked drawer resisted for about 90 seconds. She stood by the door and counted her heartbeats and tried not to calculate how much time they'd already used. Then there was a soft click, and Nathaniel said low and even, "Got it." She crossed to the desk. The ledgers were there. 3 of them bound in dark red leather, unmarked on the spines. Nathaniel lifted the top one and opened it to a middle page and held it at an angle to the available light, and she leaned in beside him. She understood numbers. Her father had been a teacher who believed that mathematics was the most democratic subject, that it could not be manipulated by charm or birth or social standing, that 2 and 2 produced 4 for a tenant farmer and a county trustee alike, and that a person who understood how to read numbers was a person who could not easily be cheated. She read the numbers on the page. She read them again. "God," she said very quietly. "Yes," Nathaniel said. The figures were not subtle. This was not a careful technical fraud visible only to experts. This was the work of a man who had been doing it for so long and with such impunity that he hadn't bothered to make it elegant. Wages recorded as paid in the public ledger appeared here as half their stated amount, with the difference routed to a management expense account that bore Caldwell's initials. Rent collected appeared at double rate, with the excess marked simply as arrears recovery, an accounting term that meant nothing here except that Caldwell had needed a word to put in the column. 3 families had lost land parcels recorded here as abandoned due to non-payment. The date of recording was 2 weeks after the date their rent had been submitted. Elizabeth recognized one of the names Pryor, James Pryor, whose lease had been rewritten twice without his knowledge, who was on her list of potential witnesses. He hadn't abandoned that land. It had been taken while his payment was still in transit. "We need copies of specific pages," Nathaniel said. "We can't take the ledgers themselves if they go missing before I have legal standing. Caldwell destroys the originals and claims they never existed." "I can copy figures," Elizabeth said. "Give me the pages." "How fast?" "Faster than you." He looked at her. She had already pulled the small notebook and pencil from her dress pocket, the same ones she'd had at the creek bench that first morning, and opened to a clean page. "Page 14, he said. "The wage columns." She wrote. She copied 7 pages in 22 minutes. She knew it was 22 minutes because Nathaniel tracked the time by his pocket watch and said the numbers quietly at intervals, and she treated them the way a sailor treats a bearing, as information that changes nothing about the work, but tells you exactly where you are. The last page was the land transfer records. She was halfway through the prior entry when she heard it. Footsteps on the front walk. Not the slow, irregular steps of old Peter. These were deliberate, healed, moving with the settled weight of a man who is coming home to his own house. Nathaniel had heard it at the same moment. His hand came out and touched her arm just once, brief a communication, and then he was at the desk closing the drawer, positioning the ledgers exactly as they'd found them. She finished the line she was on, folded the notebook, slid it into her pocket. The front door handle moved. She looked at Nathaniel. He pointed to the far side of the office behind the door's swing, and she moved there without a sound. He pressed himself into the shadow beside the window frame. The door did not open. They heard Caldwell's footsteps clearly. His now she was already learning the rhythm of him crossed the entry hall. Pause. The sound of him trying the office door handle. The office door was locked. They had locked it behind them when they came in. She had the key in her hand, pressed between her fingers so hard the edge was cutting into her palm. Caldwell tried the handle once more. Then his footsteps moved away toward the back of the house. A door opened and closed. The sound of water being poured. He had come home early, and he had come to the office door first. Nathaniel looked at her across the dark room. She could see him clearly enough to read his face, and what she read was controlled, precise thinking, not panic. He held up 4 fingers. "Wait 4 minutes." Then he pointed up the ceiling and made a questioning gesture. She understood. Was Caldwell going upstairs? She shook her head slightly. The footsteps were still on the ground floor. He pointed to the window. She looked at it. Single pane, the kind that opened outward on a simple latch. Ground floor. A drop of perhaps 4 feet to the ground outside. She nodded. He crossed to the window in 3 steps, tested the latch without letting it catch, and held it ready. He looked at her. She crossed to stand beside him. More footsteps. Getting closer. Then a voice from the back of the house, slightly muffled. Caldwell speaking to someone. Another voice, responding, younger, a man's. He'd brought someone back with him. The 2 voices moved toward the front of the house, toward the office. Nathaniel opened the window. High went out first. One movement clean landing below, with a sound that was nothing less than nothing. A man who knew how to move his own body. Elizabeth came after, sitting on the sill for half a second with her hands on the frame, and then she was down the grass, cold through her shoes, and Nathaniel caught her arm to steady her landing. They heard from inside the sound of Caldwell unlocking the office door. They were already moving. They didn't run. Running produced sound and movement that registered. They walked fast and deliberate away from the house and into the property's back perimeter, and they moved along the fence line in the dark until they were well past the range of the downstairs windows, and only then did Elizabeth let herself breathe fully. Nathaniel said nothing. Neither did she. They moved, and the property fell away behind them, and the night closed over the space they left. When they reached the road, she turned to him and said, "Did you hear what he said to the other man inside?" "Some of it." "He said, 'I want to know everything about the Whitmore woman.'" Nathaniel stopped walking. "He said it clearly," she continued. Her voice was steady. She was very proud of how steady it was. As they were crossing the hall toward the office, he said it like it was a continuation of something they'd already been discussing. "I want to know everything about the Whitmore woman. Start with who she's been talking to." The silence that followed had a different quality from any silence she'd experienced with him before. It was not the silence of thinking. It was the silence of a man who is feeling something very specific and holding it very tightly. "He got there faster than I expected," Nathaniel said. "Yes, Elizabeth." He turned to look at her, and whatever he'd been holding tightly had not entirely resolved, because she could still feel the edge of it in his voice. "You need to understand that this changes your situation. He is now specifically looking at you. If any of the people you've spoken to—" "They won't talk," she said. "You can't know that." "I know Ruth Howell," she said. "I know what she's protected for 2 years under that floorboard. And I know that Clara Bennett has been waiting for someone to give a damn about what happened to her husband's wages since the day he died." She looked at him directly. "These are not people who will crack under Thomas Caldwell's pleasantries." "It won't be pleasantries," he said. "Not anymore." "I know." She held his gaze. "How long do we need?" He worked through something behind his eyes. "If I ride to the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Richmond by Monday, present the wage and land transfer records, file a formal complaint with the documentation we copied tonight, they are required by law to open a preliminary inquiry within 30 days. During an open inquiry, Caldwell cannot legally act against witnesses or destroy records. The moment the inquiry is filed, we have protection." "Monday," she said. "That's 3 days. 2.5. She thought about Caldwell coming home early, about the sound of him trying the office door, about his voice easy and unhurried saying, "I want to know everything about the Whitmore woman." "Can you reach Gareth Howell tomorrow?" she asked. "Yes." "Tell him to move the records, not out of the house somewhere inside the house somewhere else, and tell him not to open his door to anyone he doesn't know until this is over." "I'll tell him tonight." "And James Pryor." "I'll handle Pryor." He paused. "Elizabeth, I need you to stay home tomorrow. I need you to be seen doing ordinary things, going to ordinary places. Don't approach anyone on the list. Don't send anything through Helen. Just be unremarkable for 36 hours. She wanted to push back on this. The instinct was strong and immediate, but she recognized with the part of her that always counted things clearly that he was right. Caldwell had looked directly at her. The right move was to become briefly invisible. "Unremarkable," she said. "I can do that." "I know you can," he said, and something in the way he said it, not doubt, not condescension, but a very simple recognition, made her look at him differently for a moment. Not longer, just differently. The way you look at something when you suddenly see it in better light. "Ride carefully," she said. "Caldwell has people on the road." "I'll go before dawn." He paused. "One more thing. The pages you copied tonight. Don't keep them at your rooms." She'd already thought of this. "Helen," she said. "Not Helen. Caldwell knows about Helen." She blinked. "How?" "He mentioned her name to the county clerk 3 weeks ago. Someone saw them speaking." He watched her process this. Helen isn't compromised as far as I can tell, but she's a known association. If Caldwell is looking at you, he'll be looking at your connections. Elizabeth turned this over. Thought through her circle, the actual circle, the people she trusted, not the people she saw regularly. It was smaller than it appeared. Much smaller. Patrick Oakes, she said finally. The school teacher. How well do you know him? Well enough that I've lent him books, and he's returned them. Not well enough that Caldwell would think to look. She paused. He's also on our side. He has his own ledger evidence about the school donation records. Nathaniel considered this. Get the copied pages to Oakes tonight. Tonight? Yes. She looked at the road behind them, the direction of town, the direction of 2 rented rooms, and everything she owned that wasn't in her pocket right now. And if Caldwell moves against someone before Monday? Nathaniel's jaw set. He won't. But if, then I come back from Richmond and I deal with it publicly, he said. And at that point I stop worrying about legal process, and I start relying on the fact that I am the owner of everything he has built his position on, and that I can dismantle it in a single afternoon if I have to. She heard the iron in that. Not anger, something older and colder than anger. The sound of a man who has given himself a long leash of patience and is now measuring how much remains. Don't do anything irreversible before Monday, she said. I won't. Promise me. He looked at her. The night was still around them, and the road was empty, and the space between them was the particular kind of space that forms when 2 people have been through something together and are only now letting themselves feel the weight of it. I promise, he said. She nodded. Tucked the notebook more securely into her pocket. Then go, she said. And ride fast. Patrick Oakes answered his door at 11:15 at night with a candle and the alert eyes of a man who reads late and expects nothing good from knocking at that hour. He listened to what Elizabeth told him, the shortened version, the operative parts, without interrupting once. When she finished, he held out his hand for the folded pages, looked at them for 30 seconds and said, There's a cavity in the wall behind the schoolroom hearth where I've kept 3 years of my own salary records. These will fit. She stared at him. I've been waiting, he said simply. You're not the first person to come to my door about this. You're just the first one who came with actual proof. Who else came? He was quiet for a moment. Gareth Howell, about 8 months ago. He asked if I'd be willing to testify when the time came. I said yes. He looked at her steadily. Who is doing this, Miss Whitmore? Who has the standing to take it to a level Caldwell can't control? She thought about what Nathaniel had told her he could afford to say. And then she thought about Patrick Oakes, who had kept 3 years of salary records in a wall cavity, on the hope that someday someone would ask for them. The man who owns Crawford Valley, she said. The actual heir. He's been here 4 months working the road crew. Patrick stared at her. Crawford himself. Yes, working the road. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, That's either the bravest thing I've ever heard or the most extraordinary gamble. Both, she said. He rides to Richmond Monday. The inquiry will be filed by midweek. Patrick nodded slowly. Tell him when you speak to him. Tell him that there are more people ready to stand up than he knows. More than signed any letter. People have been waiting for something real to hold on to. He looked at her with an expression that had the quality of something long suppressed finding an exit. You gave us something real, Miss Whitmore. She felt that somewhere it was hard to describe, not pride, not exactly. Something quieter. The particular sensation of having done the thing that needed doing in the moment, it needed to be done, without any guarantee it would work. Not yet, she said, but we will. Nathaniel left before 4 in the morning. He told Gareth Howell everything that needed to be told in a 15-minute conversation by the light of a single candle in the Howell kitchen, while Ruth sat at the table with her hands folded and her face very still. When he finished, Ruth stood up, went to the corner of the kitchen, lifted 2 floorboards without any drama whatsoever, and produced a tied bundle of papers that was considerably thicker than Nathaniel had expected. 3 years of wages, she said. Dates, amounts, discrepancies. My husband's hand. She held it out to him. Don't let it be for nothing." He took it from her with both hands. The weight of it was physical, and also not. "I won't," he said. "You're a Crawford," she said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him with an assessment that had been refined over 30 years of watching powerful people make decisions that affected people like her. Whatever she found in his face, it satisfied something. "Your grandfather was a hard man," she said. "But he kept his word. I hope you inherited the second part." "So do I," he said. He rode out of Crawford Valley, while the sky was still the color of old iron, and the road was empty except for the sound of his horse's hooves and the calls of birds starting up in the dark tree line. He rode with Ruth Howell's bundle and Elizabeth's copied pages, and the knowledge of 7 witnesses and 30 years of patience pressing at his back like a hand between his shoulder blades, urging him forward. He thought about Elizabeth. I thought about the precise, unhurried way she had written in the dark of Caldwell's office while they both listened to the sound of the man who could destroy them moving through the house. He thought about the moment she'd told him what Caldwell had said. "I want to know everything about the Whitmore woman," and the steadiness of her voice, delivering that information, the complete refusal to let him see her afraid, even though she had every right to be. I thought about what it meant that of all the people in Crawford Valley who had known what Caldwell was doing, she was the one who had walked across a party lawn with a bucket of water and started a chain of events that was now carrying both of them toward something that could not be undone. The road opened out ahead of him, pale in the pre-dawn, running south toward Richmond. He urged his horse forward. She did not stay home on Saturday the way she'd promised. She tried. She sat in her 2 rooms until mid-morning and read the same page of a book 11 times, and then put the book down and looked at the ceiling and thought about Caldwell moving through his office the night before, and about the question of what happened if he opened that desk drawer and looked at the ledger and noticed something subtly wrong. A page turned the wrong way, a slight displacement, the way meticulous men notice when their things have been touched. She got up. She put on her coat. She went out. She did not go to Helen. She did not go to anyone on the list. She went to the market because she always went to the market, and because the market was where she heard things, and because the thing she was most afraid of right now was not knowing what was happening. What she heard at the market stopped her cold. A worker from the roadside, a young man she didn't know by name, was telling someone near the grain stall that Caldwell had come to the worksite that morning, that he had pulled 2 men aside, that one of them had been Gareth Howell, that Howell had been taken to the estate house, that no one had seen him come back. She turned and walked out of the market at a pace that was not quite running, and made it half a block before she stopped herself against a fence post and forced herself to think clearly. Caldwell had Howell, or was questioning him, or something in between those 2 things. The records were either still in the wall, or Caldwell had them, or they'd been moved in time. Nathaniel was on the road to Richmond. He wouldn't be reachable. The inquiry wasn't filed yet. The protection of the inquiry didn't exist yet. She stood at the fence post and thought through every option she had and the speed at which each one would or wouldn't work. And then she thought about what Nathaniel had said. "Then I come back from Richmond and I deal with it publicly. And at that point I stop worrying about legal process." She thought about Patrick Oakes, about 3 years of salary records in a wall cavity, about a man who had said more people are ready to stand up than he knows. She thought about the fact that the inquiry might take 30 days to open, but that the public gathering of witnesses, the visible, undeniable collection of people willing to stand and say what they knew, could happen considerably faster. She pushed off the fence post. She went to Patrick Oakes's schoolroom. He opened the door before she knocked, as though he'd been watching for her. "I heard about Howell," he said. "How long ago?" "An hour. One of the students' fathers works the site." His jaw was set. "It's starting." "Then so are we," she said. "Who can you reach today right now? People ready to speak." He looked at her. "You're not waiting for Monday." "Caldwell isn't waiting for Monday," she said. "And I am done letting Thomas Caldwell set the pace of what happens in this valley." Patrick Oakes looked at her for a long, weighing moment. Then he nodded once with the particular decision quality of a man who has been holding himself at the edge of something for a very long time. "Give me an hour," he said. I know where everyone is on a Saturday. 1 hour, she said. Then we move. He was already reaching for his coat. Patrick Oakes moved fast. Elizabeth had expected him to be methodical, the kind of man who made lists and checked them twice before doing anything. Instead, he was out the schoolroom door in under 3 minutes with his coat half-buttoned and a look on his face that was 3 years of quiet fury finding its first legitimate direction. Eli Crane first, he said, falling into step beside her. He's closest, and his brother Samuel will be with him. They work together on Saturdays. Then Clara Bennett, then Pryor. Ruth Howell, Elizabeth said. We need to know if Gareth said anything before they took him. I'll send someone to her. Someone Caldwell won't notice checking on a neighbor. He didn't break stride. There's a widow named Agnes Forsyth, 2 doors down from the Howells. She and Ruth have been friends 40 years. Agnes can go without raising any flag. Do it. He peeled left at the next fork, and Elizabeth kept moving. She had made a decision in the 60 seconds between pushing off that fence post and reaching Patrick's door, and she had not second-guessed it since. Waiting for Monday meant Caldwell had the weekend. It meant Gareth Howell sat in that estate house for 2 more days without a single person applying any pressure to the situation from the outside. It meant Caldwell could question, threaten, and if he was desperate enough, do worse, and there would be no legal mechanism to stop him, because the inquiry wasn't filed yet, and the Valley's county officials were either useless or in his pocket. The only thing that stopped a man like Thomas Caldwell, the only thing that had ever stopped men like him, was witness. Numbers. The public accumulation of people who were willing to be seen standing on the other side of his power. She was going to build that in one afternoon. Eli Crane answered his door with a splitting axe still in his hand from the woodpile out back, which under other circumstances might have been alarming. He was a compact, weather-lined man in his mid-40s with a brother 2 years younger who appeared from around the side of the house at the sound of voices, also carrying a tool, also with the look of men who had learned to stay alert on their own land. Miss Whitmore, Eli said. His voice was careful, not unfriendly. Careful the way people are careful in a place where the wrong word to the wrong person has consequences. What brings you out on a Saturday? Caldwell took Gareth Howell to the estate house this morning, she said. No preamble. There wasn't time for preamble. He's questioning him. I need to know if you and your brother are ready to do what you told Patrick Oakes you were ready to do. The 2 brothers looked at each other. Something passed between them that was too old and too private to read from the outside, the specific language of siblings who have faced bad news together before. Samuel said, You said ready to do. What does that mean exactly today? It means, Elizabeth said, that by tonight I need a group of people in one place with their evidence and their testimony prepared to go to the estate house together and demand Gareth Howell's release, publicly. With enough witnesses that Caldwell cannot quietly make any of us disappear. She held both their gazes. And it means that on Monday, the man who actually owns this land is filing a federal inquiry in Richmond that will open an official investigation into everything Caldwell has done. But between now and Monday, I need bodies. Present, willing, and visible. Eli lowered the axe. He didn't put it down, just lowered it. The heir, he said. Crawford himself. That's who you're talking about. Yes. The road worker, Samuel said. Not a question. Something flickered in his face, recognition, recalibration. I thought there was something wrong about him. Moved too easy for a laboring man. He's been here 4 months, Elizabeth said. Gathering evidence. He has what he needs. What he doesn't have yet is 36 more hours without Caldwell destroying something irreplaceable. She paused. Gareth Howell kept records. Ruth Howell kept them safe. If Caldwell makes Gareth tell him where they are. Gareth won't tell him anything, Eli said. The certainty in his voice was absolute and unargued. That man would die first. I know, Elizabeth said. I'm trying to make sure it doesn't come to that. Another exchange of looks between the brothers, shorter this time. Tell us where to be, Eli said. And when. Clara Bennett took longer. Not because she was unwilling. The moment Elizabeth told her about Gareth, Clara's face went through 3 distinct phases of emotion in about 4 seconds. ending in a hardened resolution that reminded Elizabeth powerfully of Ruth Howell's expression when she'd produced that bundle of papers from under the floorboards. These women, she thought. They had been ready for years. They had simply been waiting for someone to open the door. The difficulty was Clara's niece. Susanna was sitting at her aunt's table when Elizabeth arrived, and she had clearly already heard something news moved through Crawford Valley's working community, the way it always moved through small places where people were afraid, fast, fragmentary, and frightening. "He's going to know it was me," Susanna said. Her hands were flat on the table. "If they start asking who knew the layout of the house, who knew about the dinner schedule, he's going to work it back to me." "He may try," Elizabeth said, "but you will not be alone when he does." She pulled a chair out and sat directly across from her. "Susanna, I need you to hear me clearly. By tonight there will be enough people willing to stand together that Caldwell cannot single any one person out without implicating himself further. And by midweek there will be a federal inquiry open that makes anything he does to any of us an act of criminal obstruction." She held the girl's eyes. "You gave us information that may save Gareth Howell's life. I am not going to let that come back on you." Susanna looked at her for a long moment. Her hands, still flat on the table, stopped trembling. "Where do I need to be?" she said. "Here, with your aunt. I'll send word when it's time." Clara walked Elizabeth to the door and gripped her arm once briefly with both hands. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. By 4 in the afternoon, Patrick Oakes had assembled 9 people in the back room of his schoolhouse. Elizabeth looked at them and felt something she didn't have an immediate name for, not pride, because pride felt too self-referential for what this was. It was more like recognition, like looking at a thing that had been forming slowly in the dark and seeing its shape for the first time in proper light. Eli and Samuel Crane sat together against the near wall. James Pryor was beside them, his lease papers folded in his coat pocket. Clara Bennett had come after all, Susanna at her side, and the girl was pale but steady. Agnes Forsyth had come from her visit to Ruth Howell, with 2 pieces of information: first, that Gareth was still at the estate house, and second, that Ruth had already moved the kitchen floorboard records to the wall space behind Agnes's own flour barrel the previous day, because Gareth had told her to move them if anything happened. Because Gareth, it turned out, had spent 30 years anticipating the day something might happen. The 9th person was a man. Elizabeth hadn't expected Peter, the estate's elderly, mostly deaf groundskeeper, sitting in the corner with his hands on his knees, and the particular stillness of a man who has decided something and is at peace with it. Patrick had found him. He had apparently walked off the estate property that morning without being told to, which meant he already knew something had shifted, and he had come to the schoolhouse because he had nowhere else that made sense to go. "He's not as deaf as he lets on," Patrick murmured to Elizabeth. "I suspected it, but now I'm certain. He lip-reads, I think. He's been lip-reading Caldwell for years." Elizabeth looked at Peter. Peter looked back at her with the mild, impenetrable expression of a man with a lifetime of practice keeping his own counsel. "Mr. Peter," she said, clearly watching his face, "did you see anything in that house over the years that you'd be willing to say out loud to the right people?" He reached into his coat and produced a small battered notebook, which he held out to her. She took it and opened it and looked at 3 years of dated observations written in a cramped, careful hand. Dates of meetings, names of visitors, descriptions of conversations. He'd had no business overhearing in the way that people who dismiss the elderly and the disabled as irrelevant routinely conduct their business in front of witnesses they don't know they have. She looked up at him. "Yes," she said, "I think you'll do just fine." She told them everything. All of it. Nathaniel's identity, his purpose, the copies she'd made of the ledger pages, the Richmond ride, the timeline. She told them because they had a right to know, and because people who are asked to take real risks deserve the real picture, and because she was done with the selective truth that powerful people use to manage everyone around them. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Eli Crane said, "What do we do tonight?" "We go to the estate house together," she said. 9 of us plus anyone else willing to stand with us. We go to the front door. We knock. We ask formally and publicly for Gareth Howell to be released, since he is a free man on Crawford land, being held without legal authority. We make it loud enough that the neighbors hear it. We make it witnessed enough that Caldwell cannot quietly manage what happens next. And if he refuses, James Pryor said, then we stay, she said. On the public road in front of that house, all night if we have to, until Monday morning, and the inquiry and the full weight of what we've gathered comes down on him. Pryor looked at his hands. Caldwell has men who aren't afraid to push back. I know, she said. But 9 people on a public road asking for a man's release is not a crime. Anything Caldwell does to stop us is. She looked around the room. We are on the right side of the law here. We have to act like it. A pause. Then Samuel Crane said, I'll get 4 more men. Give me an hour. Peter stood up from his corner. Susanna looked at her aunt and then back at Elizabeth and said quietly, I'll come too. They were 14 by 6 o'clock. They walked to the estate house in a loose group, not marching, not aggressive, just walking the way people walk when they are going somewhere with purpose. Elizabeth was at the front, which was not a position she had assigned herself. It was a position that had accrued to her over the course of an afternoon, and she recognized it without ceremony and accepted it without performance. They reached the front gate as the evening light was going amber. Caldwell was already at the window. She could see him there, a silhouette behind the glass, watching them come. He had time to calculate. She could feel him doing it even from a distance, the rapid internal arithmetic of a man assessing numbers and angles, and whether a show of force could still resolve this quietly. He sent his manservant to the door. The man was young, uncomfortable, visibly unhappy about the situation he'd been placed in. He opened the door and said in the voice of someone delivering a message he wished he didn't have that Mr. Caldwell was not available. That's all right, Elizabeth said. We're not here to see Mr. Caldwell. We're here for Gareth Howell. He was brought to this property this morning without his consent, and we're asking that he be returned to his home. She kept her voice pleasant, factual, the tone of someone making a perfectly reasonable request. Will you please let Mr. Howell know that his neighbors are here? The manservant looked at the 14 people standing in the road behind her. He looked at the axe Eli Crane was carrying, which Eli had brought in, the way that a man who'd been chopping wood all day and then walked somewhere without thinking about it might carry loosely absently with no particular menace intended, but also very visibly present. One moment, the manservant said. He closed the door. Behind Elizabeth, someone said quietly, That's right. Go fetch him. Soft sound of agreement from the group. Not aggressive, just present. The sound of people who have decided to be seen. The door opened again 6 minutes later. Not the manservant. Caldwell himself. How was composed. She had to give him that. A lesser man would have shown the calculation, the quick read of the assembled group, the reassessment, the visible recalibration. Caldwell showed none of it. He stood in his doorway with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at them all with an expression of measured patience, the expression of a man who has handled more complicated situations than this one and is mildly surprised it has come to his door. Miss Whitmore, he said, warm almost. What is this? We're here for Gareth Howell, she said. He was brought here this morning. We'd like him to go home. Mr. Howell came here voluntarily to discuss a matter of estate management, Caldwell said. He's free to leave whenever he chooses. Then please let him know we're here, she said, and that we'll walk him home. A fraction of a pause. Tiny. If she hadn't been watching for it, she would have missed it. Of course, Caldwell said. One moment. He withdrew. The door stayed open. 3 minutes later, Gareth Howell appeared in the doorway. Howe was upright and walking under his own power, which was the first thing Elizabeth checked. He had the look of a man who had spent several hours being asked questions. He didn't answer, which settled something specific in his face, a kind of carefully maintained blankness that was not emptiness, but containment. His eyes found Elizabeth and then moved across the group behind her, and something moved through him that he controlled quickly, but not entirely. He stepped out of the door. Caldwell appeared behind him, one hand lifting slightly as if to touch his shoulder, and Eli Crane stepped forward from the group, Just one step, just enough, and Caldwell's hand came back down. "Gareth," Elizabeth said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he said. The two words came out with a compression that suggested he'd been saving them. She turned to Caldwell. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not quite anger, not quite calculation. Something that had elements of both, and something else underneath them. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man who has just realized he has fundamentally misjudged something. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," she said, pleasantly. "Good evening." She turned back to the group, and without another word, they walked away from the estate house. Gareth Howell, in the middle of them, solid and real, and the sound of 14 pairs of feet on the road was the most satisfying sound Elizabeth had heard in years. They took Gareth to Patrick Oakes's schoolhouse because it was the largest private space they had, and because Ruth Howell, when Patrick sent word, arrived within 20 minutes and crossed the room to her husband with a directness that made everyone look away for a moment, not from discomfort, but from the private weight of it. Gareth held his wife's hands in both of his and said very quietly, "He doesn't know where they are." Ruth put her forehead against his. "I know," she said. "I moved them." He looked at her. "You moved them?" "Yesterday, when you told me to move them if anything happened." He breathed out long, slow, releasing something that had clearly been locked very tight all day. "Good woman," he said. "Obviously," she said, and patted his hands and sat down beside him. Elizabeth watched this and thought 30 years. 30 years of this man keeping records in the dark on the faith that something would eventually matter. On the faith that someone would eventually come. She looked at Patrick, who was watching the same thing. "We need to send word to Nathaniel," she said. "How he's already on the road." She thought about this. Where would he stop tonight? He'd need to change horses. Halfway house at Waynesboro, probably. That's the standard stop on the Richmond Road. "I need someone fast on a good horse." Eli Crane looked up from the other side of the room. "Samuel's horse is fastest." Samuel, without being asked, stood up and held out his hand for the message. She wrote it on a page from Patrick's ledger. Short to the point, the operative facts: Howell free. Records safe. Group assembled. Caldwell knows movement is organized. Come back via county road, not main road. 9 witnesses with documentary evidence ready. It is happening faster than Monday. E.W. She folded it and handed it to Samuel. "Don't give it to anyone but him." "How will I know him?" "Gray eyes," she said. "Broad through the shoulders. He'll be the man who looks like he's been carrying something heavy for a very long time." She paused. "Tell him Elizabeth says don't do anything irreversible. He'll know what it means." Samuel took the message and was out the door. Caldwell moved before morning. She should have anticipated it. She had anticipated it in the abstract, in the part of her mind that tracked these things. But the specific form it took caught her sideways. He went to Robert. Her cousin Robert, who had red-faced concern and no backbone, and who was by all the measurements that mattered in Crawford Valley the closest thing Elizabeth Whitmore had to a legal guardian. Not because she was 24 years old and entirely her own person, but because in the social architecture of this world, an unmarried woman with no property was understood to be in the sphere of her nearest male relative, and that nearest male relative was Robert. She knew what Caldwell had said to him because Robert appeared at her door at 8 in the morning and could barely look at her. "He told me," Robert said, "that you have been inserting yourself into matters of estate business, that you have been organizing," he used the word agitating among the worker families, "that you have associated yourself with a man of unknown origin who is attempting to defraud the Crawford estate." He stopped, swallowed. "Elizabeth, he says if you don't remove yourself from this county within 48 hours, he will have you charged with civil interference in trust administration." She looked at her cousin, at his genuinely distressed face, his genuine belief that he was trying to help her. "Robert," she said, "do you know what trust administration means?" It means he has been running the Crawford estate without oversight for 12 years. It means the person being trusted to act in the estate's interest has stolen from it systematically and covered his tracks through the county record system. She kept her voice even. Not angry, just clear. A civil interference charge requires a plaintiff with standing. Thomas Caldwell does not have standing to bring that charge. The estate heir does. Robert blinked. The heir is no one knows where. He's in Richmond, she said. Filing a federal inquiry. He'll be back by tomorrow. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man whose understanding of a situation has just been restructured in an uncomfortable direction. Elizabeth, Robert said, very quietly now. If you're wrong, I'm not wrong, Robert. She looked at him steadily. I have never in my life been more certain of anything. She opened her door wider. Would you like to sit down? I'll tell you the whole of it. Because when this is over and Caldwell is gone, someone in this family should understand what actually happened here. And it may as well be you. He came inside. He sat down at her small table. And for the first time in the 2 years since her father's death, her cousin Robert sat across from her and listened. Truly listened, without looking for the place where he could manage her. Nathaniel came back late Sunday afternoon, not through the county road, the way she'd told Samuel to tell him. He came through the back of the valley, the long way around the way that bypassed the 3 points on the road where Caldwell's men had been since Saturday morning. She learned later that Samuel had found him at Waynesboro and that Nathaniel had read her note twice. Handed Samuel a sealed letter for the federal commissioner's office, told him to ride it the rest of the way to Richmond, and turned his own horse around. He found her at Patrick Oakes's schoolhouse, where she had been for most of the day, coordinating testimony preparation with the assembled witnesses. He walked in the door and stopped. She looked up from the table where she'd been writing. He looked at the room at Gareth and Ruth Howell, sitting together against one wall at the Crane brothers at Patrick. At his desk at the papers, spread across the tables at the organized, functional breathing shape of everything she'd built in 36 hours. He looked at her. You did this, he said. We did this, she said. Sit down. There's a lot you need to know before tomorrow. He sat. She talked. He listened with the complete, undivided attention of a man who has been carrying a problem alone for too long and has arrived somewhere it is no longer entirely his to carry. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Caldwell went to your cousin, he said. Yes. And Robert is at home processing the situation, she said. He won't interfere. Nathaniel nodded slowly. The letter I sent with Samuel, it wasn't the original inquiry. I filed that before I turned around. The letter was a request for immediate investigative presence. There is a federal land commissioner's deputy who should reach Crawford Valley by Tuesday morning. He paused. But I need Caldwell documented in the act of obstruction before then. What happened with Gareth? Peter wrote it down, she said. She slid a paper across the table. He was on the property. He has 3 years of prior documentation and a same-day account of Caldwell detaining Gareth without legal authority. She watched him read it. And the 14 people who came to the estate house door are all willing to sign witness statements. He put the paper down. He looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at her, and in his face was something that hadn't been there before. Not the careful control, not the measured assessment, but something underneath those things, something that had been kept back for a long time and was now very quietly moving toward the surface. I owe you an apology, he said. She hadn't expected that. For what? I spent 4 months doing this alone because I didn't trust anyone in this valley to help without getting hurt. I had decided somewhere in those 4 months that the safest thing was to keep everyone at a distance. He looked at her steadily. I was wrong, not about the caution, about the distance. He paused. You turned this from a legal case into a community, and that is, it's a different thing entirely. It's a stronger thing. She held his gaze. You came back from Waynesboro, she said. When I told you it was moving faster than Monday, you turned around. Yes. Without arguing, without telling me I'd moved too fast or taken too much on. You hadn't, he said simply. No, she said. I hadn't. She picked up her pen. So here's what happens tomorrow. She laid it out the same way she'd laid everything out directly, completely, without softening the parts that were hard. Caldwell would resist. He had allies in the county who would move to protect him once they understood the federal inquiry was real. There would be a period of genuine legal chaos before the inquiry's protections fully settled in, and during that period, Caldwell had room to maneuver. The answer to that room was to eliminate it. "The county gathering," she said. "The monthly civic meeting. It's tomorrow afternoon. Every man of business in the county attends. Alderman Hargrove chairs it." She looked at him. "You stand up at that meeting and you say who you are. In public. In front of the county men who have been conducting business with Crawford estate funds for 12 years, and who have every personal and financial reason to care that the estate's actual owner has returned." Nathaniel was very still. "The moment you do that," she said, "Caldwell cannot quietly manage anything. He can't claim fraud. He can't reroute the conversation through county officials. He can't make it a private matter, which is the only kind of matter he knows how to control." She held his gaze. "You make it public, and it stays public, and that is the one thing he has no tool against." He was quiet for a long moment. "It means the pretense is finished," he said. "Yes. Every person in that county meeting will know who I've been and what I've been doing. Some of them are not going to be pleased. Some of them are going to be terrified," she agreed, "because they have been doing business with a trustee who had no legitimate authority, and they are now going to have to account for every transaction they've made through the estate in 12 years. She let that land. "But that is their problem, and it is a real problem, and it is the right problem for them to have." He looked at her. Something in his expression settled, not resolved, not relaxed, but found. Like a man who has finally located true north after a long time navigating by approximation. "I'll need to say something to Gareth first," he said. "Before the meeting, privately. Of course. And to Ruth." "Yes." He stood. She stood. They were very close in the small space of the schoolroom, closer than they'd been except for the dark of Caldwell's office, and the quality of this proximity was different from that one less emergency, more presence. "Elizabeth," he said. She waited. "What you did while I was on the road." He stopped. Started again. "It was the bravest thing I have ever seen anyone do. And I have been in some situations where bravery was the only currency available." She thought about a bucket of water on a July afternoon, about a bench at dawn and a market stall and a dark office and 14 people walking down a road together. "It wasn't bravery," she said. "It was just unwillingness to accept the alternative." He looked at her for a moment with that unguarded quality she'd seen only twice before, the first time when he came back to consciousness on a dirt road and found her already there, and the second time when Samuel Crane brought him her note, and he turned his horse around without debating it. "I think," he said carefully, "that might be the best definition of bravery I've ever heard." She picked up her journal. "Tomorrow," she said. "County meeting. 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock, he said. He turned toward Gareth Howell's corner of the room, and Elizabeth watched him go. This man who had come back through the long way around the valley because she'd told him to. This man who had listened. This man who was about to stand up in a room full of people who had benefited from his absence and say clearly and without apology that he was home. She sat back down at the table. She opened her journal. She had a great deal left to prepare. The county meeting was held in the largest room of Crawford Valley's Civic Hall, a building that Nathaniel's grandfather had funded that bore the Crawford name on a plaque above the door, and that Thomas Caldwell had been using for 12 years as the backdrop for his own authority. Elizabeth arrived 40 minutes early. She sat in the back row and watched the room fill. She watched the men of business come in twos and threes, shaking hands, exchanging the comfortable pleasantries of people who expected this gathering to be exactly what it always was. She watched Alderman Hargrove take his chair at the front, with the settled comfort of a man who has never once walked into a room uncertain of his welcome. She watched the county clerk, a young man named Foster, who had replaced Aldous Webb 2 years ago, and who had to his credit no visible relationship with Caldwell that she'd been able to trace, arrange his papers with the anxious precision of someone who sensed the atmosphere was different today without knowing why. Caldwell came in at 5 minutes to 2. He saw her immediately. He was too controlled to show it, but she saw the fraction of a second in which his eyes landed on her and registered something not surprise, not quite. More like confirmation of a suspicion he'd hoped not to have confirmed. He took his usual seat near the front and set his ledger on his knee and looked forward. He did not look at the door when it opened again, but everyone else did. Nathaniel walked in at 2 o'clock exactly, and he did not come in as a road worker. He wore the clothes he had ridden to Richmond in plain, but not rough, the kind of clothes a man of means wore when he wanted to be taken seriously without performing it. He had shaved. He carried nothing except the sealed copy of the federal inquiry filing which he had in his coat pocket. He had spoken to Gareth that morning, as he'd said he would. The conversation had taken 40 minutes, and Elizabeth had not been present for it, but she had seen Gareth's face afterward, the expression of a man who had waited 30 years for something and had finally received it not as a gift, but as a reckoning that had been owed all along. He had spoken to Ruth too. She had listened, and then she had said in the precise way of a woman who measures her words, "You have your grandfather's face. I wondered when I saw you at the Hargrove party if I was imagining it." She had paused. "I wasn't." He had not known what to do with that. He'd told Elizabeth about it briefly on the walk to the Civic Hall. His voice had been steady, but his jaw had done the thing it did when he was containing something larger than usual. She had not commented on it. She'd just walked beside him and let it be there. Now she watched him cross the Civic Hall floor and take a seat in the middle of the room. Not the back, not the front. The middle, where he could be seen from all directions. Alderman Hargrove looked at him with the mild puzzlement of a man encountering a face that belongs to a category he can't immediately place. Caldwell still did not look at the door. The meeting opened. Hargrove called through the standard items of business road maintenance funds, the question of the mill lease, a property boundary dispute between two families on the valley's western edge. Elizabeth watched Caldwell manage each item from his seat near the front. The practiced ease of a man who has run these meetings sideways for years, who knows which conversations to advance and which to slow, whose voice carries the accumulated weight of unchallenged authority. Then Hargrove said, moving to the final item, "Any other matters before the assembly?" Nathaniel stood up. The room shifted the way. Rooms shift when someone does something unexpected. Not noise exactly, but a reorientation. Heads turning. The quality of attention changing. "My name is Nathaniel Crawford," he said. His voice was even and clear and carried to every corner without effort. "I am the son of William Crawford and the grandson of Elias Crawford, for whom this valley is named. I have been residing here for the past 4 months, and I am the sole heir and legal owner of the Crawford estate." The silence that followed was total. Then it broke all at once. Several voices overlapping the specific chaos of a room in which a foundational assumption has just been removed. Hargrove's voice came over it. "Order, order." He was staring at Nathaniel with his mouth slightly open. "Young man, do you understand the seriousness of what you're—" "I do," Nathaniel said. "I have a copy of the birth registry from Christ Church, Philadelphia, my father's will filed in the Philadelphia County Records in 1804, and a letter from the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Richmond, acknowledging the formal inquiry I filed on Saturday." He reached into his coat and held up the document. "I am also in possession of documentary evidence that Thomas Caldwell, who has served as trustee of the Crawford estate for the past 12 years, has systematically defrauded that estate and the families who depend on it in the amount of no less than $14,000 through falsified wage records, illegal land transfers, and manipulation of county filing records." The room exploded. Elizabeth did not move from her seat. She watched Caldwell. He stood. He was still composed. She had to keep giving him that it was his most dangerous quality, and he turned to face the room with the controlled authority of a man who believes he can still manage this. "This man," Caldwell said, pitching his voice to carry over the noise, "is a common laborer who has been working the Eastern Road contract. Whatever documents he claims to have are fabricated. I have managed this estate legally and transparently for 12 years, and I challenge him to produce a single $14,000, said Gareth Howell. The room went quiet again. Gareth was standing in the doorway. Behind him were Ruth and the Crane brothers, and James Pryor, and Clara Bennett, and Susanna, and Patrick Oakes, and Agnes Forsyth, and Peter, and 4 other men. Elizabeth didn't know by name, but who Patrick had assembled, and her cousin Robert. She had not known Robert would come, had not asked him to, but there he was, red-faced and resolute in the way of a man who has made a decision. He's not entirely sure about, but intends to stand by. 17 people in the doorway of a civic hall in Crawford Valley on a Monday afternoon. Caldwell looked at them. For the first time in everything she had watched him do, his composure showed a crack. It was small, it was brief, but it was there. "I have records," Gareth said. He walked forward. His limp was more pronounced than usual. Whatever had happened during the hours at the estate house had cost him physically, but his voice was absolutely steady. "Personal records I kept since 1806. Wages promised against wages paid. The gap month by month, year by year." He stopped in the middle of the room and looked at Caldwell directly. "I kept them because I knew someday someone would come back who had the right to see them, and I was prepared to wait as long as it took." Caldwell turned to Hargrove. He made the pivot smoothly, which was the last smooth thing he did in that room. "Alderman," he said, "these are tenant workers with a grievance. This is the appropriate venue for—" "The appropriate venue," Nathaniel said, "is the federal inquiry which is already open. What this is, the appropriate venue for, is this." He looked around the room at the assembled men of business at Hargrove, at Foster, the county clerk, who had gone pale and very still. "Every man in this room who has conducted financial business with the Crawford estate in the past 12 years. Every contract, every lease agreement, every transaction run through Thomas Caldwell as trustee is now subject to review under that inquiry. Any cooperation you offer the commissioner's deputy who arrives Tuesday will be noted." He paused. "Any obstruction will also be noted." The word obstruction landed in the room like a stone in still water. Elizabeth watched the ripples move across the faces of men who had been doing comfortable, unexamined business for a decade and had just felt the ground shift. Foster, the county clerk, cleared his throat. "Mr. Crawford, the filing records. If there has been manipulation of county records as you're suggesting." "There has been," Elizabeth said. Every head turned to her. She stood up from the back row. "I have copies of specific ledger pages from the estate's private accounts," she said, "showing parallel entries to the county filing records with significant discrepancies. Those copies are in the hands of a third party and are available to the federal commissioner's deputy on Tuesday." She looked at Foster directly. "The original manipulation predates your tenure. The inquiry will establish that clearly. Your cooperation with the review process will determine how this reflects on the current office." Foster nodded rapidly. "Of course. Full cooperation. Absolutely." Hargrove was looking back and forth between Nathaniel and Elizabeth with the expression of a man trying to find the thread of a situation that has come apart faster than he can follow. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I must say, your involvement in this—" "My involvement," she said calmly, "consists of giving water to a man who needed it and then following where that led. I make no apology for either action." Someone in the room, she couldn't see who, made a sound that was something between a laugh and a cough. Caldwell moved. He moved for the door, and the movement was controlled and purposeful, the exit of a man who has calculated that the room is lost and is pivoting to the next position. I was good at it. He got halfway to the door before Eli Crane stepped into the gap, not blocking exactly, just present, just large and specifically placed, and Caldwell stopped. "The inquiry is open," Nathaniel said from across the room. His voice had not changed. "Leaving the county would be characterized as flight. The commissioner's deputy has your name and description." He held Caldwell's gaze across the full length of the hall. "You are welcome to stay in your position in this house until Tuesday morning. At which point, I will be assuming direct management of the Crawford estate, and your services will no longer be required." Caldwell looked at Nathaniel. The calculation was visible now, even through the composure, the rapid interior arithmetic of a man running out of columns that add up. "You have nothing solid," Caldwell said. "Copies of documents made by a woman with no legal standing. The word of tenant workers against 12 years of county-filed records. "I have the ledgers," Nathaniel said. The room went very still. "The originals," he said. "The secondary set. I have had them since Saturday evening." Elizabeth looked at him. This was not something he had told her. He met her eyes briefly across the room. There was something in his face that was almost apologetic, the look of a man who had kept one card back, not out of deception, but out of the particular protective instinct of someone who has learned not to put everything into play until the moment it is needed. Caldwell's composure broke, not dramatically, not with raised voices or visible collapse. It broke the way things break that have been holding past their limit for too long, suddenly and completely, without any intermediate stage. His shoulders dropped a fraction, his jaw unclenched. The calculation in his eyes went out the way a lamp goes out when the oil is finally gone. "The ledgers," he said, flatly. A statement, not a question. "The secondary set," Nathaniel said. "All 3 volumes. In the custody of a federal officer in Richmond since Saturday." Because he had. On the road to Richmond, he had not just filed the inquiry, he had carried with him the ledgers that Elizabeth and he had decided not to take because he had gone back for them. Alone in the pre-dawn hours before he rode out, he had gone back to the estate house, and he had used the 4 minutes and the metal tool, and he had taken the red leather volumes, and he had ridden south with them before the sun was up. He had not told her, because there had been no moment to tell her that wouldn't have also been a moment to argue about it. And he had known she would argue, because she always argued when the risk was his rather than hers. Elizabeth looked at him for a long, specific moment. He looked back. Later, she would not be entirely certain what she felt in that moment. It was too compound to name cleanly. There was irritation, because he had done exactly the thing she would have told him was too dangerous. There was relief because it had worked. There was something else, something quieter and more unsettling, which she filed away to examine later when the room wasn't full of people. She turned back to Caldwell. "It's over," she said, not harshly, just clearly, the way you say something that is simply and completely true. The commissioner's deputy arrived Tuesday morning as promised. How was a compact man named Harrison, with the efficient humorlessness of a federal official who has done this before and intends to do it correctly. He set up in the civic hall which Hargrove made available without being asked twice. He had the county records pulled by Foster within the hour. He interviewed Gareth Howell for 90 minutes, during which Ruth sat outside the door with her hands folded and her face composed, and only Elizabeth, sitting beside her, knew from the tension in the woman's shoulders how much that stillness was costing her. Gareth came out looking tired, but not diminished. He sat down next to Ruth, and she took his hand, and he leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes and breathed. "He said we have the strongest tenant fraud case he's seen since the Western land grant disputes," Gareth said without opening his eyes. "Said the double ledger alone would be enough. The rest is, he called it, extraordinary documentation." Ruth patted his hand once. Firm and short, the gesture of a woman who has been vindicated, but is too practical to be surprised. "Good," she said. Elizabeth looked at them and thought about all the years between the first falsified wage entry and this Tuesday morning. About the particular cruelty of a slow theft, not the sudden violence of losing everything at once, but the grinding, demoralizing accumulation of small amounts, taken promises, broken dignity, quietly withdrawn. About the decades of patience it took to keep records under a floorboard and not lose faith that the records would one day matter. Patrick Oakes appeared at her elbow. "Harrison wants to speak with you," he said. "You're next." The interview lasted an hour. Harrison was precise and impersonal, which she found easier than sympathy would have been. He asked about the copied ledger pages, the chain of custody, the circumstances of access. He asked about her involvement with Nathaniel Crawford and the timeline of the investigation. He asked about the witnesses she had assembled and how she had documented their accounts. She answered every question completely and without embellishment. When he asked about the night at the estate house, the office, the window, the floor plan, she told it plainly in the same register she might use to describe a trip to the market. Harrison looked at her over his papers when she'd finished and said, You understand that technically, the manner in which the initial document review was conducted was inadmissible, she said. The copies you made taken as primary evidence, yes. Which is why Mr. Crawford retrieved the original ledgers before he left for Richmond, she said. The copies were never intended to be primary evidence. They were verification. Proof that what we were looking for existed before we committed to the legal retrieval. Harrison considered this. You planned it that way? Yes. He looked at her for another moment. You have a methodical mind, Miss Whitmore. My father taught school, she said. He believed that a precise mind was the most democratic advantage a person could possess. Harrison made a note. I have one more question. Off the record. She waited. When you first gave water to a man on a road in July, he said, did you know who he was? No, she said. I knew he needed water. That was all I knew. He nodded slowly. He closed his folder. I have interviewed a great many witnesses in fraud cases, he said. In my experience, the cases that succeed are almost never the ones with the most evidence. They're the ones with the right first action, the thing someone did before they knew it would matter. He paused. Good morning, Miss Whitmore. She walked out of the Civic Hall into the August air and stood for a moment with the sun on her face and let herself feel completely, and without management, the full weight of everything that had happened since July. It was heavier than she'd expected, and lighter. Both things simultaneously in the way that relief often is. Caldwell left Crawford Valley on Wednesday. He was not arrested, not yet. Harrison had explained that the formal charges would follow the full inquiry, which would take 30 days, and that Caldwell was legally required to remain accessible but was not in custody pending that process. He left anyway before the morning was properly started with one trunk and his manservant, and the look of a man who has understood that a place has become uninhabitable. Elizabeth heard about it from Helen Archer, who had seen him go. He looked, Helen said with a careful neutrality that was its own kind of verdict, like a smaller man than he used to. He was always that man, Elizabeth said. He just had 12 years of other people's money making him look larger. Helen looked at her with the thoughtful attention she'd been directing at Elizabeth since that first July afternoon when she'd said he was looking at you. What happens now? She said. Nathaniel assumes direct management of the estate. The tenants' leases are being reviewed, all of them. The wage shortfalls are going to be repaid from the estate accounts. It will take time. She paused. And the school's funding is being restored, with interest. Helen smiled. It was a small private smile, the kind that meant something was right with the world, in a way that didn't need to be announced. And you, Helen said. What happens to you? Elizabeth looked down the market lane, the same lane she'd walked every Thursday for 2 years, gathering information in the currency of ordinary presence. I don't know yet, she said. I'm thinking about it. Nathaniel found her at the creek bench on Thursday morning. She was there first, as she always was. Journal open, pencil in hand. The bench, the creek, the light coming through the trees at the angle of late summer, moving toward fall. All of it exactly as it had been on a morning in July that felt somehow both very recent and very long ago. He sat down. Not at the far end. Closer. She did not look up from her journal. The prior land is reinstated, he said. I filed the correction with Foster yesterday. James Pryor has his parcel back with a proper lease that cannot be amended without his signature. Good, she said. The Crane brothers' wage claims are being settled from the trust account. All of the documented shortfalls with 5%. He paused. I'm putting Patrick Oakes in charge of the school fund. Direct oversight independent of estate administration. She looked up from her journal. He'll do that well. I know. He turned the hat in his hands. That gesture she had learned over the course of a summer meant he was arriving at something. I also spoke with Gareth this morning about a position. Estate steward properly paid with full authority over the tenant agreements and a seat at every administrative decision. He paused. He said he'd think about it. Ruth said yes immediately. She felt something move through her that arrived as warmth and settled as something more complicated. 30 years, she said quietly. I know, he said. It doesn't fix 30 years. But it's the right position for the right person, and it should have been his a long time ago. The creek moved below them. The morning was already warm, the last warmth of summer beginning to carry the first suggestion of something cooler in its edges. "I owe you something," he said. She looked at him. "You don't." "Not a debt," he said. "I mean, there is something I have been carrying since the morning you walked into Caldwell's office and copied 7 pages of financial records in 22 minutes while I counted time." He stopped. The hat stilled in his hands. "I have been trying to find the right words for it since then." She waited. "I spent 4 months in this valley, deciding that the safest thing was to need no one," he said. "It was a practical decision. I had reasons for it, good ones." He looked at her steadily. "And then you walked across a party lawn with a bucket of water, and within a week you had dismantled every reason I had for keeping people at a distance." She was very still. "Not because you argued against those reasons," he said. "You never argued, you just did things, and each thing you did made the reasons for distance seem smaller and the reasons for being near you seem larger, until I was sitting in a Waynesboro wayhouse, reading a note from you, and turning my horse around before I had consciously made the decision to turn it." The morning held them both very quietly. "Nathaniel," she said. "Let me finish," he said. "Because I have been practicing this since Tuesday, and if you interrupt me, I will lose my place." She put the pencil down. "I am not going to pretend," he said, "that what I'm about to say doesn't come with complications. I own a great deal of land, and a considerable legal mess, and the goodwill of people. I have to earn back slowly, and none of that is a simple thing to share with another person. I know that." He met her eyes. "But I also know that the bravest, most clear-eyed, most genuinely decent human being I have encountered in my life sat on this bench in July and told me she didn't form alliances with people whose pictures weren't whole. And I would like very much for you to know my whole picture." She looked at him. At the man who had worked a road in the August heat to understand what had been taken from the people whose names he carried, who had kept records in his boot, who had turned a horse around without debating it, who had gone back for the ledgers in the dark before dawn because he understood without being told that protecting others sometimes meant taking the risk yourself. "I already know most of it," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you, I want you to know the rest." The creek moved below them. Somewhere across the valley, the work was continuing the work of repair, of reinstatement, of the long and undramatic process of putting things right that had been made wrong. It would take months, probably years. It was not a story that ended cleanly on a single morning, but on this morning on this bench. Elizabeth Whitmore put down her journal and looked at Nathaniel Crawford, this man who had been a stranger lying in the dirt in July, and was now something for which she did not yet have the precise word, and she made a decision. Not the decision he'd asked for. She was not ready to make that decision in words yet, and she would not make it before she was ready. But a different one. The one that mattered first. "All right," she said. "Tell me the rest." His breath went out slowly. He began to talk. She listened the way she listened to everything completely without performance, without filling in the spaces before they arrived. The creek moved and the morning warmed, and the summer held its last heat around them like it was reluctant to let go. 3 weeks later, the federal inquiry returned its preliminary findings. Caldwell was formally charged. The documented fraud was confirmed at $11,000 in wage theft and an additional $4,000 in illegal land transfers, somewhat less than Nathaniel's original estimate. But Harrison said it was the cleanest case he had prosecuted in 15 years of federal land work, and that the combination of the original ledgers and Gareth Howell's personal records was, in his words, the most complete documentation of estate fraud I have encountered. He said this in the Civic Hall in front of Hargrove and Foster, and every man of business who had attended the Monday meeting, and the silence in the room was very different from the silence that had greeted Nathaniel's announcement 3 weeks before. This silence had the quality of reckoning. The land transfers were reversed. James Pryor received his parcel with a new lease witnessed by 3 people, including Elizabeth. 2 other families received similar restorations. The cases of the workers whose wages had been shorted went to a separate proceeding that Harrison said would take longer, but that the documentation made the outcome in his estimation certain. The missing worker. The one Nathaniel had feared for the man from Kentucky, whose family hadn't heard from him, turned out to be alive. He had left the valley voluntarily after Caldwell threatened his lease, walked west without telling anyone, and was located through the Inquiry's witness network in a town in Tennessee where he had found other work. He was written to. He wrote back. It was not a full resolution, but it was better than the alternative Elizabeth had quietly feared. Patrick Oakes received his school fund. He cried briefly, standing in the civic hall with the written authorization in his hand, and then composed himself and said, "Right, I have 3 years of curriculum to catch up on," and went back to his schoolroom. Gareth Howell accepted the steward position. Ruth, who had not been surprised by this, had already mentally reorganized their household before he finished saying yes. On the last day of August, Nathaniel asked Elizabeth to walk the estate with him. Not the grounds of the house, the land. The actual parcels, the farms and timber and creek boundaries that made up Crawford Valley in the practical sense. He wanted to see it the way the people who lived on it saw it at ground level, with someone beside him who understood what she was looking at. They walked for most of the day. He asked questions, and she answered them, and she asked questions, and he answered them, and in between the questions, there were long stretches of comfortable silence, the kind that requires a specific amount of shared experience to produce and cannot be manufactured. At the end of the afternoon, they stood at the eastern boundary of the property, the furthest point where the Crawford land met the road that ran north to town. The unfinished section of that road, the one that had been under construction in July, was nearly complete now. "My grandfather built half of what this valley is," Nathaniel said. He was looking at the road. "And took credit for more than that. My father inherited the land and spent 20 years being careful with it, which isn't the same as being good with it." He paused. "I came back here because I felt obligated. Because the letters from Gareth made me feel the weight of what had been done while I was away." He looked at her. "I didn't come back because I thought I could make it right. I came back because I thought I could at least stop it getting worse. And now," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Now I think it might actually be possible to make it right," he said. "Or closer to right. Not all the way. 12 years doesn't get unwound in 30 days. But closer." He paused again. "That change in what I think is possible is, I want you to know it's yours. A significant part of it." She looked at the road. At the work that had been done on it, the progress measured in packed earth and cleared stones, the ordinary labor of building something that would outlast the season. "It's everyone's," she said. "Gareth's and Ruth's and Patrick's and the Cranes, all of it." "Yes," he said. "But you were first." He turned to face her. "You were the first person who looked at what this valley was doing and decided without being asked, without being compensated, without any guarantee that it would matter, that it was worth acting on." She looked at him. The afternoon light was going toward evening, going the color of the late summer air, which was golden and tired, and held something in it that smelled like things ending and things beginning at the same time. "I just gave someone water," she said. "No," he said quietly and firmly. "You didn't just do anything. You never do. That's the part I want you to stop saying." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "All right." He held out his hand. She looked at it, this hand she knew now, with its roadwork calluses and its deliberate steadiness, and she put hers in it. They stood at the eastern boundary of Crawford Valley, as the day finished itself around them, and the road ran north toward town, and the land ran in every direction, with all its complicated weight of history and harm, and the slow, real, unglamorous work of repair. It was not a perfect place. It would not become one. The wrong that had been done to it was 12 years deep, and would take longer than that to grow out of the way. A tree grows around an old wound, slowly, imperfectly. The mark still visible if you looked for it, but the living wood continuing in every direction outward. But the people were still here. The Howells and the Cranes and James Pryor and Patrick Oakes and Susanna and old Peter with his notebook and all the women who had lowered their voices in market stalls for years and were learning one careful conversation at a time that they didn't have to anymore. They were still here, and they were no longer without recourse, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. Elizabeth Whitmore had walked into a summer party in a washed-out blue dress, with no ribbon and no prospects, and no one in the room who thought she mattered, and she had looked at a man dying in the sun and made the only decision that made sense to her. She had not known that the decision would matter. She had not done it because it would matter. She had done it because a human being needed water, and she had some, and the rest of the calculation was not one she had ever been able to make. But it had mattered. It had mattered in ways that would continue to matter long after this August evening, long after the inquiry closed, and the charges were settled, and the leases were rewritten, and the school fund paid its first properly funded semester, and Gareth Howell sat at his steward's desk for the first time with his 30 years of patience finally properly housed. It had mattered because that is what acts of genuine decency do. They do not arrive with guarantees. They do not come with knowledge of their own consequence. They come from the simple radical decision to see another human being clearly and respond to what you see. And the woman who had been invisible, who had been the poorest guest at the party, the one who wasn't quite invited, the one who wasn't quite seen, had turned out to be the one who saw most clearly of all. Nathaniel Crawford held her hand at the edge of his family's land and looked at her in the way he had been looking at her since the first moment his eyes came into focus on a dirt road in July and found her already there. She looked back at him without pretense and without performance, and with the full weight of everything she was, which was, she was beginning to understand considerably more than anyone in this valley had ever been willing to see. "Come on," she said. "We have work to do tomorrow." "We do," he said. They turned away from the road's edge and walked back toward the valley side by side in the last of the light. The greatest inheritance is not land. It is not wealth or a name or a position conferred by birth. It is the courage to look clearly at the world in front of you, at the person lying in the road, at the injustice conducted in plain sight, at the thing everyone has agreed to pretend not to see, and to act on what you see, without waiting for permission, without waiting for certainty, without waiting for someone else to go first. Elizabeth Whitmore had always known this. She had known it in the bone-deep way of people who have had to live by it. Now, for the first time, the world around her was beginning to know it.